10-minute warning. Hey, nerds. Hey. We're on YouTube. This is fancy. Hey, Paige.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, Allie.
It's sent. Just let me know when y'all get it and we can get started. Yeah. All right. Is everybody good? Yeah. Okay, sweet. Advantage warrants the private sector. Unilateral invocation of Article 5 against our hybrid threat spurs private sector backlash. Shows public-private co-op broadly and undermines the alliance credibility. Only limiting activation unilaterally solves its lets Rosen movement 16 Article 5 protection. The private sector should proceed with counsel in this area, overstates capabilities and limits credibility. Made West confined ambitions to govern, defense, and rethink domestic infrastructure. The protection of the private sector's diversity perspectives of crisis management risk do not exist at all. And they don't mention to make the essential coordination with the private sector exponentially harder. Revisiting Sony and how it's so different. Crisis management. They will do well to remember how complicated it is. One private sector unity was not possible. Government was not able to manage the crisis. Apple would it be less likely to cooperate with an alliance? Whatever the company said involved in their business interests and refuse the private sector not separate anything the government protecting their interests. Equation is not likely unless private sector becomes an essential action in decision making. The shared dependency provide the opportunity to remake decision making here to forward the solely to the government. Like how would remaking process NATO would be wise to constrain ambition, defending its own networks and resiliency. Would should plan and protect the digital strikes and proudly own infrastructure. Inclusion on hybrid threats is key, including the private sector and activation discussion spills over by building trust enables a framework co-op that's coordinated 19 hybrid threats and companies priority to mention this from ranging from cyber attacks to critical services remains different now than vulnerabilities presented by globalized world targets a hybrid given the main private sector's ability to detect hybrid activities there is initially dependent on close operation when the private sector response even more reliant on public-private cooperation. Very few discussions encountering hybrid threats among NATO as well the whole private sector critical services relies on the private sector services necessary to take the next step of the SR exercise would include the private sector including private sector and they will all started in the discussion that we need to close things to have inclusion of secondary business discussion the relations of the build on how they trust will go beyond the dialogue and deeper level of cooperation. They how do deeper private cooperation and new models of evaluation and companies to cooperate more closely without a risk of a loss. Co-op with the private sector is key to win the innovation race and establishes tech norms with low values as marrying to the competition and creativity good for the lines of defense and opening guard markets good for creativity. This maximizes the innovation the disruption they say those advantage alliance wide public-private cooperation to scale up necessary to recording these companies. So we are doing the technological race that liberal values and every advantage we need to work at the speed of relevant tech as we look towards NATO. There was an innovation that leverages our advantage. We're critical to the alliance maintaining the edge and build shared values. It causes extinction. That's Jane 19, the IoT, 5G, space cyber department's benefits. We carry down, raise autonomous weapons, get it, turn on the creators, rolling in sanctions, 3D printing. We use our rogue state, printing arms race and proliferate genetic engineering, private classes, people, direct energy, man, and global stability. Greatest source coming from the rest of the attackers when the attack raise the U.S. and domestic allies to harness the national opposite of mitigating downside. They were being D10, but converted standards for little values and tech chains. The D10 ensures the U.S. and allies are maintaining the innovation wage. Now, NATO partnerships solve cybersecurity risk by aligning defenses. A collaborative, non-adversarial model is key to overcome trust gaps. In 18, the cybersecurity is unmeasured. The social danger. Estonia being like the two example wars experience turning point following the election hacks reality foreign government is such a penetrating systems attempting with democratic institutions Russian when securitization, cutting edge technology, on innovation, and pragmatic course, the divided responsibility of the Republican Party, the voice of framework, while private companies will share in the public institution, macro level analysis would result in high level of security. The ideal is blemished by lack of cooperation and the symbolic estimated relation to the development of civil society and security imposed strict obligation. The private entity reported notion of the particular instead of incentivizing companies to collaborate. The two sectors benefit from working together to develop superior intelligence partnership by fueled by governments overcome mutual defense and incentive cooperation. NATO three P's are key to prevent grid shocks, integrating the private sector builds resilience and response measures to OKSRs and 13 liberalization is put in first than NATO the hands of the private sector. The governments are able to provide with the private sector the accommodation the government diminish what the private companies need to minimize costs to create the situation which neither are able to or are willing to provide the security, physical, cyber domains, and critical energy, the infrastructure and coordination that can be imperative in defending against cyber and physical infrastructure attacks. They could have which we thought national security the importance of the information and coordinating the only increase in society becomes reliant on interconnected computer systems and critical infrastructure and interdependence mechanisms for failure on one of the cascaded with the others. The partnership will have a very hard to key to create a framework of the on threats affecting critical infrastructure coordinate action and information sharing is two with the public sector even more fast and to develop information that energy sectors are incentivized to partner with government, the public partner, private partnership that are indispensable to cyber violence, critical energy infrastructure, comprehensive infrastructure, information on threats and incidents that are essential to understand the risk and development their present preventative measures and potential crisis, which each sector knows how to mitigate risk. Grid collapse causes extinction as Weiss and 19 loss of the grid would turn to the distribution of oil and gas and rock the telecom would collapse finance and banking all tech infrastructure services attack would collapse water infrastructure days death and days the food production would collapse crops were water to attack 2% of the population would feed 98% would starve. There was no electricity for a very long time. The plan never had a core payment offering for survival was no plan. Cyber risk spill over to space vulnerabilities failure in 18 the outer space and cyberspace converting the internet depends on space communication and service operations set over and networks meshing the organic geopolitical competition that fuels military in the state with the heightened incentive to devise cyber interference with structure. China engaged in cyber operations against U.S. assets for war fighting critical infrastructure. Other countries believe the U.S. could conduct cyber operations against space assets of rivals. The small set of revolutions unfolding in surface space activities expand underneath the ILA. No diplomacy is grappled with space cybersecurity controversy over how ILA would apply to cybersecurity. Affected diplomacy states that conduct cyber ILA. No space war goes nuclear. Often it's an offense dominant domain that's Gregor 18. Space is often dominant that can lead to special ciphers that don't exist in other domains, even as all states. As all sides prefer not to engage away any act in the space. Weapons are an important part of the military process. If you use it or lose it, pressure they can compress elements coupled with difficult determining the cause of satellite degradation lines of mission are built. Satellites provide early warning associated include a turn also where missile defense where a state to use early warning to enable launch an attack. Interference might be interpreted as a precursor to nuclear attack that accelerated use of nuclear weapon intelligence and containing horizontal escalation and hostile the target space capabilities not clear with the red lines now only increasing trust can solve our internal links at pitch. In 18 the cyber will not work in digital cyber private sectors involved the NATO president form for exchange interest in NATO's role in helping the region's governments increasing trust between states and private sector and alliances a clear interest in fostering public-private cooperation network production and all critical infrastructure under military control of civilian networks would love to individual allies and attack that real economically damaging and difference that next is the espionage advantage. Blowing lines between espionage and war causes cyber arms racing encourages preemption. That's one of the 13 the cyber war rhetoric is serious consequences of war rhetoric that provokes wars at level of emergency level and investigates countermeasures that lead these arms racing espionage not equate to a warfare that making link unjustifiable espionage not as business on military spying campaign may lead to war that interpreted to justify preventive attacks. You know, wars become vague. The espionage should be separate potential loss and risk of the freedom and curtails participation is substantial. Now, differentiating from espionage from cyber war in NATO is necessary to avoid total war. The UN 15 international policies should clarify how cyber fit in the ILA that helmet on step in the right direction. Espionage unaddressed what cyber wars ability to deploy disrupt the capabilities and conduct surveillance mechanisms usually important proposals should account for the value in cooperation. The absence of cooperation states may use levels to obstruction control where overreaction to cyber espionage makes violent escalation inevitable. That's leaving in 21 this battle to talk about gun rules. The most important thing is different to attack the espionage. Sullivan being described as a formal, but it was the latter. The only country that carried out the sabotage of the U.S. and Israel. Espionage is something that is issue all the time. Hacking economic with spying and first sabotage. The key goal to be established a very clear red line. You know, clear tradition in place and concerning cyber espionage. There's a serious risk of overreacting to leading spiral escalation that causes a nuclear war with Russia extinction. That's maybe in 19th threat of nuclear catastrophe. The greatest false and security limits vulnerable to policymakers thinking neither set wants nuclear wars. He says unlikely, but wars not always begin by design. Cyber technology employed blind the espionage warfare, anything nuclear and conventional weapon in the race the offensive to defensive ops not hard to mention a crisis scenario in which Russia gains access to second control of the conventional nuclear weapons, leaving Americans uncertain whether intrusion them to disable nuclear strikes causes a user to lose a decision market, user to lose a decision, confusing cyber attacks and espionage risk, conflict with Beijing that's Cunningham and Buchanan in 20 the political crisis get escalated. Cyber could add incentive of the use for cyber offensive capabilities risk and invert escalation. One of the escalation pathways distinguished between cyber espionage and cyber attack. This distinction creates pathways inverted escalation. The state could misperceive intelligence preparation to conduct attack and preempt most attacks are not destructive enough. The worst in the conflict outcomes. The Sino-American crisis is the most likely case. Taiwan 03 or the E and SCS going to spell an armed conflict. Cyber capabilities and companies Sino-American crisis sensitivity. The difficulty of distinguishing cyber attacks from the espionage requires the decision maker to use force before networks are degraded. estimated that triggers a nuclear escalation with China that's symbolic in 20 months. A crisis has begun nuclear danger will appear for nuclear force use may become very thinkable to analyze with respect to China. Unconsiderable signals will be perceived as perception motivation of reasoning biases during a crisis involving use of force. Motivational construction may vary across cognitive constraints and subjective judgment. Miscalculation can be a heightened amount of uncertainty. Activation can be interpreted as preparation to conduct a nuclear missile strike during escalation. Distinguishing between espionage, which is targeted at commercial entities, and military infrastructure is key to norm setting on the acceptable response to espionage. As Fung in 14 handwriting obscuring the key point of the cyber warfare military definition. I call it interest in definite act of war makes it harder to distinguish national security threats. Inflected one makes it harder for America to shape the international norms of how and when they use cyber weapons in order. The next attack, ambiguity and confusion lead to mistake the battle to determine what corporate networks exposure to business information military activity. Someone like nothing more better to have a definition of war to expand the explosive lines between cyber warfare than espionage. A very bad thing. It's the number of scenarios requiring military responses, spending resources, and pressure on the U.S. to engage reciprocal behavioral cyber disadvantage. Blurring the line justifies disproportionate adversary response to American espionage and guarantees cyber sabotage. As leaving in 21, the overreaction would mean that as is bound to happen, Russia and China discover cyber espionage. The U.S. will not only justify and disproportionate escalatory response, but it will actually be justified. Russia would regard a move in the actual war. The Russian responses, including a move to China's geopolitical camp, the way everyone without a doubt will have to move to cyber sabotage. Thus, the plan. The United States federal government should reduce its alliance commitment to North Atlantic Treaty Organization member states by limiting the conditions under which attacks on private critical infrastructure can activate Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Cyber sabotage compromises NC3 systems and go nuclear. That's clear in 19 offensive operations. Sabotage cyber centrifuges efforts by rebels to degrade nuclear infrastructure prevalent Russian planet mall where they intend to cut off or NPT facilities on the event of a crisis. This was escalation from non-kinetic to kinetic escalation within the use of cyber weapons is in a crisis free command and control and communication of or the risk of a follow-up that attacks and fueling loss of its own arsenal launch a weapon that might occur between NATO and Russian forces, between the US and Chinese forces. Both sides where they intended to go early. The Pacific might choose to strike first, even limit attack like set up both sides, and then stop for the sake comes to believe the systems are infected. Leaders might not trust information, leading to overreact. Launch nuclear weapons uncertainty could jeopardize nuclear deterrent. The state may interpret the confusing signals of launch a weapon rather than lose them. I'm going to finish the BB card. One deal in the states that believe they are understalled. Deterrents can increase the odds of war use and large in NATO and perceive use involved in Russian internal affairs and commitments to Department of American forces. Actions other than Russian meddling convince Washington Moscow is going for the Jedi experience. This spiral phenomenon with Georgia. Marked it with Georgia.
We're going to take some prep.
$7:45. Okay. Are you good? Northwestern, are you good?
Yeah.
Can you hear?
Oh yeah, I can hear now. So my first question is, what is the difference between like public and private critical infrastructure?
Like who actually owns the infrastructure?
So what are examples then of the attacks the plan would exclude compared to ones that would be defended after the plan?
So only attacks, things that are only private critical infrastructure. So if there are shared pieces of infrastructure, or if it serves a public function, it can still be responded to under Article 5.
Okay, so my question then is, how does reducing Article 5 commitments spur cooperation with the private sector then?
Yeah, the argument is that the Rosenblum card outlines how the private sector has an issue with the way that Article 5 can be invoked on attacks on their infrastructure now. That's how it spurs it. I believe the Courtney and the Murray evidence indicates that when the private sector is more willing, that the private sector would be more willing to work with NATO on like other issues about kind of developing interoperability of their systems to protect against things like cyber attacks, etc.
It's a trust internal link.
Yeah.
They don't like that
Trust internal link. So
that NATO can get involved because they want to be, in charge of responding.
okay, if they don't want NATO involved, what is the difference between cooperation between NATO and the private sector and then an Article 5 commitment to protect the private sector?
Well, because the thing is sorry, are you asking what is the difference between the AF and cooperation with it? Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, I'm confused as to why incentives are different when NATO is just cooperating without an Article 5 guarantee and then cooperation with an Article 5 guarantee.
Because so the Rosenblum evidence indicates that when Article 5 is invoked, it forces companies to do things against their will, which they don't appreciate, which is the distinction between why that cooperation would look different in the world of the AF versus in the status quo.
Okay. That makes sense, I guess. I guess the espionage advantage, why does the plan, how in any way does the plan differentiate espionage from cyber war?
Yeah, the liminal evidence indicates that the plan would create a difference between kind of incursions with business
this
incentives
is just
versus
no. This is just
describing.
this is describing cyber war rhetoric as meaning different things. Why does limiting in Article 5?
No, it's saying that governmental cyber war rhetoric.
If I can just cut in, the reason why private critical infrastructure attacks would not trigger Article 5 is because they are primarily espionage-based attacks and not, other forms of cyber attacks. So it says espionage.
What card? Okay, then what card do you think you have on disadvantage about Article 5 commitments being necessary to sort of make that distinction?
Well, our argument is that we should limit it out from being considered an armed attack. Article 5 says that we will defend against things that are armed attacks, and the plan says it is not an armed attack.
Okay, do you have a card on this advantage that you'll point to for that?
All of the cards say that it shouldn't be legally considered
all of the
liminal card, the U card, and the Fung card.
Rep. Yep. 7:45. Starting now.
Okay, we used 54. Oh, Nick has it. Never mind.
I have it at 6:47. Is that what you have, Lee?
I have it at 6:49. So
I'll take the 2 seconds.
I'll give you 2 seconds. I'll give you time moves differently in Alabama. I think it's just like a.
Okay, let me send this.
Is everyone having fun? We do debate for fun, right? This is fun. That always gets chuckles.
Arvin, can you send it? My computer does not want to upload anything from the Dropbox. Let me try again. I'm just gonna save it to documents first, but. Okay, there you go. The order is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 off. The private sector advantage, the espionage advantage.
Nick, do you need me to send it?
No, I got it. I sent it out. It's good. Yeah. Okay. Are we all good? Can I just get a thumbs up when everyone's ready?
Have you given an order?
Yeah, I'll give it again. I think I said 6, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 6 off, the private sector advantage, and the espionage advantage. Good. Yeah. Okay, sweet. First off, is that hostilities counterplan the United States Congress ought to hold that military responding to NATO armed attacks on private critical infrastructure would infamously enter the United States into hostilities under the war power solution that broadens the legal scope of hostilities. That's key to WPR enforcement, ability, and constraining presidential applications of defense like law. Between hostilities and partisan missions of coalition within NATO, the article proposed the following words: department U.S. forces, regular forces, president's created set obligation, international parties, opposed to legal justification of forces, citations, inside NATO, and codes for the justification of international law do not just the constitutional question WPR intended to solve. Constitutional party relations or proxies and the mission executive as not to constitute hostilities, non-members role. Constitute hostilities under WPR. The article proposes recognize hostilities in common situation where the U.S. forces are used as subjects as lethal authority constitute original conception. This definition serving to training and attempting to discredit the WPRs and establishing congressional oversight over treaty justifications for the use of force curtails executive war powers. Fisher and I said the most striking gave no war powers. The extent to which the president's use of authority, international institutions, particularly North Atlantic Council, this represents an effort to strip the House, the discussion of Korea, Iraq, Haiti, Bosnia, presidential secretary Congress by relying on the UN or NATO to the removal attacks represent a narrow greater power of the authority beyond defensive operations reserved for Congress. The Council of Defensive War was taking unilaterally authority or greater concern with our operations after World War II power, particularly under resourcing nothing in the history of NATO implies the unilateral power to wage war. Presidents routinely invaded to initiate military operations and strong congressional war power solve deterrence. Terrorism in Asia War, Waxman in 14D, the Security Council includes terrorist proliferation, WD changing balances of East Asia. The administration relies on the third and the fourth with the German adversaries invading the reassuring allies of credible threat of forces significant deterring Chinese Korean aggression and stabilizing arms, race legislation introducing naval opponents and minority informed impact on the executive decision regarding force presidents statistically will be more selected issues. Congress matters greatly to we can say enemies and allies are reflection in making the threats more credible. Observe that the president would not issue an anticipate opposition legal clarity be important to turn the ambiguity. The president's deterrence undermines credibility, but ambiguity allow a congressional solely for the deterrence to maintain the of the world order. Next off is politics. Infrastructure passes now. PC is key. Lies in 23 with House compelling infrastructure bill, major investment, manufacturing, transfer in the country versus losing superior accommodating with be in the heart of the Biden sales. Biden has bipartisan meeting. Biden has how much to pay to Republican voters. White House inviting Republicans across the legislation have been bipartisan policy infrastructure shares within the Republican day more than ever bipartisan to clear infrastructure meeting and reducing alliance commitment triggers congressional infighting that stops PC Republican 17 negotiation recommitment would be difficult. Parties would oppose challenges part of the South Troops in South Korea when according to abrogate the defense act with Taipei Democrats and Republicans in Congress and raise treaties engage congressional influence allies have tried to have legislative interest groups and administration revises agreements. The law of domestic infighting and infrastructure investment is key to growth, climate legitimacy, and pandemic response. Anderson 19 infrastructure underlies all economic activity. Infrastructure helps minimize damage over such working effectiveness and stimulus turns allows project to be effective and facilitate growth, climate, risk lifetime generation, deterrence, change climate will prompt longer growth as short-term evident GDP recession when infrastructure makes the most sense and slow growth causes nuclear war and breaks down global cooperation. Land grab 17 nuclear countries both those the anti-globalization fuels national more serve Russia. And China terrorism, climate change, cellular growth, uncertainty about the U.S. miscalculation, increase rate of conflict, slow growth will drive attention, fueling nationalism. Major economies will shrink the workforce and productivity while recovering from crisis. High debt, weakening demand, governance, remote climate change, the height of health threats and demand, collective action, warming causes extinction, carbon 18, climate change, and acidification, risks and shorts. This becomes a positive feedback loops and surprise climate acidification directly counted food and water shortages, great conflict, climate change, expected to exacerbate water security, like positive feedback loops, warming cause CO2 release, catastrophic fires, catastrophic demanding off guard, produce an apocalyptic event, runaway climate change, close the exponential growth. Next off is the offensive cyber counter counterplan, the United States federal government should increase its offensive cyber capabilities with NATO member states, including increased resources for training operability in cyber, event attribution and memorandum of understanding for joint operations. Increasing NATO's offensive cyber operations is key to deter hybrid assaults. Focusing on delineating Article 5 activation is worse by promoting a reactive and defensive approach to loosen 15 cyber defense has become a component of NATO planning. The defense can be more priority discussions focused on the cyber and security. Article 5 leading NATO no reactive mode when it comes to cyber, lack of offensive cyber capabilities, affects the ability to deter NATO credibility across offensive cyber operations. Adding offensive cyber capabilities to NATO will increase its deterrent capabilities. Failure to erode a credible deterrent. Next off is the energy counterplan. The United States executive, via classifying the clarifying instrument, ought to restrict the circumstances under which Article 5 of the Washington Treaty can be invoked in response to cyber attacks on election, transportation, financial infrastructure, economic pressure, deployment of irregular armed groups. The counterplan picks out of energy. NATO cohesively expanding Article 5 commitments to counter energy disruption now to be 113 Alliance emphasizes the importance of energy security. Brussels increase our alliance of critical energy infrastructure by an adversary with the temptation to disrupting the energy supply. Under related infrastructure provided attack vectors which the adversary could lose the battle part every impact NATO forces would have this effect. They could covered by Article 5 alliance have to develop Article 5 responsibilities far back in the 2008 allies noted NATO's role in energy 2020 science attack about authorized a task group focused on energy security. The key aspects of the alliance-wide over energy security provided a range of possible mitigation strategy countermeasures members states can implement ability to deny involvement in attacks. NATO is uniquely positioned to consolidate allied efforts in Article 5 activation deters Russia's use of energy coercion. Government in imagine Moscow pulling an EU member to choose between energy or support a U.S. policy back to European energy security now before Russia get to hold NATO should choose manipulation energy supplies triggered Article 5 nature introduce split the alliance energy as weapon NATO. Article 5 would be working as turn against the ground recipe for developing publicizing NATO's ability to support a member and under attack reduce the likelihood of attack in the first place. And energy wars escalate Holstein in 20 even a slight escalation energy could have a kick-off warfare. The blend between security and economic becomes the breath precedent. LA contract devastating biological chemical WG resulting in the breakdown of any glue or instability to destroy infrastructure on a European crisis alone. Tipping points makes war. Next off is the joint posture counterplan. The United States federal government should broaden the conditions under which its Article 5 Defense Pact is activated to include a cyber and hybrid attacks and jointly develop, implement, and publicize a suite of thresholds and countermeasures to ensure proportionate retaliation to hybrid attacks that activate the Defense Pact with supportive member states in conjunction with NATO should increase cooperation with the private sector on cyber threats and declare that there is a distinction between cyber war and cyber astronauts. Tiered Article 5 response solves standards and 18 cyber attacks result and tangible consensus standards should be the scale of the effect cyber attacks should be analyzed under a tiered structure to respond effectively, proportionally. Tier 1 analyzes whether the attack resulted in destruction of property loss. Allies such a state would respond in self-defense. NATO must determine an armed attack occurred in Article 5 of the Treaty 3 would not result in destruction of property and life. The proportional countermeasure will be factor reflecting the kind of degree the tenor reads the use of force would be necessary in proportion. NATO should take steps to enact these suggestions. Sex office pro-lift Biden reassures NATO now or it is the one who sent Biden pledged the amendments of the collective defense Biden told Somalia intend to rebuild and establish our alliances. A clear shift from Trump hearing the president. The Article 5 was too powerful and treaty commitments are sacrosanct. Convening Article 5 unleashes a wave of proliferation. Cube 10 and 19 the NATO is more likely to conquer Russia. Not getting to Article 5 without sources effective to NATO remains the premier institution consolidating trades and alliance to the Russian China despite Trump militaries working together. Defense spending is rising. Treaty commitments are sacrosanct. nations to live by their commitments. Not sure if the U.S. should stand by Article 5 whether concerns Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the U.S. available commitments will raise. That's what U.S. globally, Asia, Middle East, South U.S. commitments towards the Japan, South Korea could be seeking nuclear weapons. The treaty commitments are sacrosanct. International standard rather should stand by commitments. German prolific cascades causes Russia war. Ishinger in 18. The Germany calling question credibility of NATO's nuclear deterrent and the had enough relation regime. Turkey pull following suit of Germany nuclear bomb would damage the strategic environment in Europe. Russia would interpret Germany nuclear as direct and would military countermeasures that make it harder to pursue peace and security. German nuclear ambition would be jeopardize the direct balance of power in Europe, including Germany, France, and calculable consequences for the EU nuclear weapons. Be a long game moving advantage. 1. Deterrence check space war. McDonald in 16 any kind of uncertainty compounded effectiveness and dependencies on the damage just to harm. So no country would want to gamble with a single throughout the snobby space with the average conversion. Worst case assessment the leader adversaries were saying that the own uncertainty present become important. The adversaries investment capabilities in our states that adversary must be deterred initiated on willingness to accept a risk exactly less of chopping than that agrees with our adversary retaliate on uncertainty stabilizing. 2. No grid hack impact. Kraken 16 actively shutting off the lights causing chaos. More complicated persons to what program may gain access to power utility. So it doesn't mean the results will be power to take down the control system. Power grid is more there's a panel digital button and something to allow utility work. You can have the ability to manually control the machine flipping dispensers. No evidence where which the utility shut down power. 3. The threat of military force under Article 5 deters and de-escalates a Russian hybrid attack. Says in 16 debate over the Russian cyber war is sufficient. Article 5 is concerned Little Green. Then Article 5 is concerned the constitute non-biggest arm attack. Little Green just support nothing ambiguity allow us to same wait until you make goodies calculate and increase the difficulties with theory of our top step force will enable NATO remains committed to mutual defense. Article 5 is not a hold the alliance loses credibility, desirability, Russia restricted NATO individuation. Article 5 response to hybrid warfare, interaction, military force field, anxiety, and the annexation of Crimea, which other than the responsibility for acting to spice force intervention is appropriate is the only successful reaction to military response. 4. Hybrid wars and effective.
Let's get Nick advantage 2.
Advantage 2. Okay, espionage advantage. 1. No risk of hybrid or cyber warfare on 14D. We found actual of cyber conflicts overstaying better explaining interaction and conception, escalating cyber conflicts. They do not want to risk war. Cyber capabilities are totally constantly overstaying clearly in operation in cyberspace. They rival war blatantly attack because they do not respond with it. If devastating cyber conventional forces fear collateral damages, the prevent cyber conflict, the risk cyberspace rival with the attention forces violence of fear, escalation, the absence of territorial invasion. 2. No Russia war. Handling cyber 19D refers to Russia's evidence to the war like concept. We are still working with Russia on the key global security concerns. Russia's role is especially important when it comes to power of the UN. Most Moscow support American policy in the EU and NATO's alliance remains across members significantly increase the defense budgets they represent a budget for its relief that he get away with all out invasion. Said European sanctions help dissuade any further Russian aggression efforts. We can choose existential risk of the Cold War. 3. No U.S.-China war. Ethan Thompson, 17. U.S. tensions are unlikely to lead to war. The military underscored distance and the leaders face the strongest and defined ways out defending the crisis. Matters avoid down war to escalation. This manifests itself involving incident U.S.-China military. Even the relation to escalate hostile rivals less withdrawn from the past have limited applicability and interdependencies. Far more complex lethal weapons. These features affect the willingness that leaders to escalate far more. I can't review holds a list suggestions that all with rivalry are going to go to war. Go back to the private sector advantage. They don't solve for their internal links. The private sector doesn't have control over all critical military infrastructure, which means that they can't solve for all attacks.
All right. Let's talk about the Joint Posture Counter Plan.
Yep.
Who gives NATO access to information of when an armed attack has occurred on, or any attack has occurred on private infrastructure?
Well, so Plank 2 says that there's sort of a joint posture that's developed, publicized, so the United States would be working in conjunction with NATO member states.
Yeah, no, my question is, so cyber attack happens on Sony. How does NATO know about it?
The United States would convey that information to them.
How would the US know about it?
Because part of the Plank says that we're going to cooperate with private entities.
Why do they do that?
What?
Why would they do that? Why would they share like their like corporate information on hacks, etc.?
Well, so I don't think that the private sector has to reveal any sensitive information in intellectual property in order to just reveal to the United States and NATO that they were cyber attacked. I think in the Sony example,
maybe you're right about whether or not they were cyber attacked, but once they've been cyber attacked, how does like NATO and America know, what was taken, what was accessed, etc.?
I don't understand. Plank 3 of the counter plan is pretty clear. It says the United States, NATO, and private corporations will work together to resolve these cyber threats. We think
that's pretty clear to you?
Yes, we think that Sony, in the event that they are cyber attacked, they have an incentive to give information to the United States and NATO to retaliate to the threat.
Okay. The energy so what are the net benefits to the energy like counter plan thing at the top?
It's internal.
Just the internal one? Okay. Does the counter plan result in restricting the circumstances under which Article 5 can be activated on like all cyber attacks except for like energy attacks?
We think so. We're not exactly sure if, depending on what the 2AC says, we're thinking about a 2C amendment to this counter plan, but like as it's been written currently, we think it's on all electrical, transportation, financial, etc. Depending on what the 2AC says, it might get amended. We're going to see what you say in the 2AC.
I'm just going to start this now. Do you think you have a piece of evidence that says that energy infrastructure is solely owned by the private sector, especially in Europe, which is what your DA is about?
So like we have not read this card yet, but I think that we can make arguments in the block about how energy is currently used and owned by private sector.
Well, some of it is so like, okay.
And this argument certainly cuts back both ways. And sort of the last argument I was making on the case, it's like not all critical infrastructure is owned by private companies, which means that you don't solve a lot of your advantages.
Like we'll bite that for sure.
Sure, like yeah. So that solvency deficit cuts both ways in the sense it's like, yes, it also means the counterplan isn't perfect.
The politics decide who changes their mind, what senators.
What Arvin helped me out.
I didn't.
Yeah. What senators change their mind? I think it could be both Democrats and Republicans because all of them support alliances. The passage scenario relies on bipartisanship. So if you break
So it's bipartisanship, both of them. Cool.
Hold up. So you're saying that it passes through like normal means, not reconciliation?
Not reconciliation.
Yeah, we're starting.
Okay.
I stopped time for a second, y'all. I opened one too many files and my computer got angry.
All right, hands up. Hands up. All right, that's
I'm
right.
trying to fix it.
Okay.
I think
Mainly
it's fixed. Can I check?
I don't know. Can you, Nina? I don't
Yeah,
know.
I'm checking. Okay, it looks like.
You might just need to quit for it.
I see the hands up. See, now I know she's not from me. She's like,
I
hands up.
can't, I can't make sure it's working.
It's okay. Digital debate's just the best.
It's doing fine. I'm gonna restart it.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, that's fine. I'm just sending it. I won't even give the order until I do that because that's the point. Okay. Oops. Do we have everyone here? Let me know when y'all get it. Are we good for an order? So it'll be the first advantage, second advantage, the joint posture counter plan, the OCO's counter plan, the Congress hostilities counter plan, the energy pick and DA, prolif politics. And I think it's a little bit in a different order in the doc. So if y'all want to like move it around to make it a little easier on yourselves.
Nina, could you get that again, please?
Yeah, Advantage 1, Advantage 2, Joint Posture Counterplan, OCOs Counterplan, the Congress Hostilities Counterplan, Energy Pick and DA, Prolif DA, Politics. Anyone not ready? Advantage 1 deterrence does not check space war classes without private sector cooperation. That's how we beef up our architecture. Grid collapse tells cause extinction. There's no plan for it. No way to support food, medicine, supplies, etc. That's why some ways, yes, we solve our internal links. They're only about private sector cooperation. They have no evidence on it. They conceded tech norms and space terminal impacts, so no new block defense. Deterrence is feeling out. One commitment is not credible. Russia doesn't think we'll respond to Article 5 with espionage. That's Rosenblum. Empirics, Russia and Chinese espionage attacks are escalating in the status quo. Strategic ambiguity fails for cyber espionage. Unless they see strategic deterrence, how would people do such pattern to use deterrence policy feeling your clear front local problem money as we characterize as saber. Vandalism every house of cyber tragedy that occurs the use of forces just how we use cyber tragedies was associated with publicity might include cyber espionage and having necessary stuff the use of the consider cause is belly me more precision language with understanding where red lines are complete to calculation escalation one with conflict is required for the US access link we can climb make fresh hackers impression use is uninteresting used to be for white but cyber action equals an armed attack 2 no link they have no evidence of corporate espionage the plan still keeps attacks on government critical infrastructure under Article 5 which also solves the energy GA third collaboration with the private sector solves deterrence and modernizes NATO cyber architectures and further deterrence by denial that's Rosenblum and Courtney Advantage 2 yes Grace our advantage is about espionage which happens all the time and US overreaction to it is our internal language they don't answer overreaction to cyber espionage goes nuclear blurs the lines between war and peace each actor is likely to miscalc and wall back down once the spiral starts let's leave it in B policymakers underestimate the risk blur in the Rhine causes war with China political tension makes it more likely that leaders won't back down which their defense cannot assume that's Cunningham and Buchanan causes nuclear winter blots out the sun that's symbolic they conceded the cyber sabotage impact which is more likely to cause extinction because it degrades NC3 infrastructure freezes command and control and produces pressures to launch first that's clear the joint posture counterplan 1 Article 5 limits are key to Advantage 2 explicitly ruling out cyber espionage as an armed attack is key to prevent escalatory responses. That's Limnell U and all of Crossex. If the counterplan does this, it is indistinguishable from the F2. Article 5 limits are key to Advantage 1A. Trust threat of invoking A5 for attacks on private critical infrastructure chills cooperation. That's Besh. They don't want the government stepping on their toes. That's Rosenblum, which also means the plank to just increase cooperation doesn't solve because that's what the status quo is attempting to do. B cohesion, keeping NAF on the I5 on the table makes response ineffective because different industry voices can't agree. That's Rosenblum. C clarity and then reset the other. Then publicly sure being one cry also does not identify specific accountability that governments to focus to call out by behavior focus on private sector case accountability. Microsoft along with Facebook limiting cost of such action fee for a cry for robust cyber deterrence cost use is curious and one requires all delivery to the native where the cyber attacks be characterized understand when coupled lack of clarity responses highlight and good need for additional lessons are leading concerns that informed about undercover attack there's a more extensive interpretation Sony Hack one crime petty attacks would be a violation need more precise conversation about specific attacks D gut check they have no evidence about corporate espionage generic measures don't work without including the private sector first because the government doesn't operate all of critical infrastructure third permutation do both shields the link sends a signal for recommitting to allies that overwhelms the plan for permutation to the counterplan 5 it links to the net benefit planning for hybrid threats forces us to clarify thresholds balloon salvo 18 political consultation about solutions to include discussion threshold for triggering responses to hybrid operations including Article 5 OCOs counterplan everything above applies all of our 5 Article 5 key warrants this is not meaningfully distinct from the F they have no evidence about espionage they have no evidence about attacks on critical infrastructure how OCOs would deter attacks on critical infrastructure why permutation do both but not overwhelm that because the plan does not stop us from using OCOs for anything that is not cyber espionage attacks Article 5 is key to coordinating with the public sector to make OCOs effective it doesn't solve our innovation internal links permutation do the counterplan I already said permutation do both conditionalities a voting issue for Tracy time is trash queue makes research difficult it does matter for new apps otherwise we would be disincentivized from breeding them the Congress counterplan permutation do both solves the net benefit 1 it still research congressional authority but the perm looks like the executive is just following through 2 plan is secret can't overwhelm 4 perm do the counterplan plan doesn't have to be the exact Anderson nation constitution identifying process for withdrawing relieving question who is the authority and permutation do the plan the USFG should reduce its alliance commits to NATO member states by limiting conditions under which attacks can activate Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty limited intrinsicness is justified against non-germane counterplans permutation do the plan through the process of the counterplan perm has Congress claimed the authority over the hostilities and then declares we won't invoke Article 5 in response agent counterplans are a voting issue encompass substantive F offense and distract from topic education doesn't solve the case 1 causes fideris the counterplan doesn't change when Article 5 can be invoked just says force can't be used it doesn't solve 1 A espionage they have to rule it out explicitly from being classified as an armed attack B private sector already read an argument for why clarification on Article 5 thresholds is key to diplomacy Congress handcuffs U.S. Negotiating power figure 19 I give you the The president's diplomatic activities that poor person Congress has opinion, president not be trusted not but what related to Congress and president possess diversion measures we can use to negotiate power, compel leave another country engage in the president. And knows Congress is authorized to pass a bill differently for contravening the president's position for the harmful festival diplomacy, signing a diplomatic judge to begin with executive legislation not interfere executive have freedom to dictate diplomatic approach. Third, certainty key to private sector risk sharing. Jones 18 partnership based on cost of risk sharing consortium EU under different ideas with creative risk and negotiations without clarity. Unlike the private sector is willing to assume any risk, the counterplan fails. The president will simply violate the statutory interpretation. Positive 11 statute become dead letters. There's insufficient political backing for laws to ensure continue vigor. Letter Congress does not possess the willpower to employ override mechanisms. Even the statutes change the rules, so the policy cannot without permission. President simply ignores the statutory command. Market simply ignores the statutory command. It's struck down by the court. Fletcher 20 Trump with the backing of the Supreme Court has sole authority to determine foreign affairs. President from legal all certain authority to take one-sided action even when Congress attempts to force president to club. The White House will start to break the legal shackles and hit the presidential power. Trying to continue Trump to his constitution confers on law about it. To manage foreign affairs, no spillover. Congress will stick to party lines. Historically lacks the will to intervene in foreign affairs. The energy pick permutation do both. It solves the net benefit. It still deters Russia for attacks on public energy infrastructure, which is what the entire DA is about. Permutation do the counterplan. One, the plan does not ban Article 5 for attacks on energy infrastructure, just substantially reduces when Article 5 can be applied to attacks on the private sector. It's only about corporate espionage, given all of advantage to their evidence says NATO's energy infrastructure plan is for public infrastructure to be not only 13 hybrid energy warfare in areas such as military, operational effectiveness, communications, network, market-based economies, and maintaining vital energy sector services to society and public confidence in their governmental institutions. It does not solve the ruling out attacks on private infrastructure is key. Otherwise, the private sector refuses to cooperate with NATO, and we have to limit out cyber espionage attacks for it to be a strong enough signal and norm to solve advantage 2. Picks or voting issues, steal substantive 1AC offense are moving and make it difficult to debate, especially when the plan does not specify which attacks are limited out. NATO solves energy security risks now. Dupe adult 21 Alexander NATO's role in energy security. NATO formally authorized research groups to focus on energy security, trying to get research tax analyze infrastructure ultimately co-occurs the allies research teams identify vulnerabilities to energy warfare research provide a range of mitigation strategies and countermeasures, rapid developments, technologies, NATO's unique position mitigate vulnerabilities that leverage lessons learned, give Russia's dependence for energy revenues in European market being intentions to avoid temporary disruptions, social stability, rest on energy exports article where free to fall constitutes suicide links between Russia and Europe are fundamentally different. Russian Ukrainian relationship places stronger position mark in a stronger position. No Russian provoked energy wars would end Putin propagate 20 given Russia's dependence on energy revenues. European market would be in the best interest to avoid temporary disruption, social stability, rest on export energy decision follow work is a to convince suicide between Russia and Europe is finally different. Russia-Ukrainian relationship places a stronger position, but Russian use now side both sides don't use my customers may be sourcing the love for significance to the economy. Pro-FTA one alliance collapse now. A commitment not credible. Applying cyber espionage to Article 5 is not credible. Threatens cohesion. Resolution B response fails. Allies won't agree to invoke Article 5C. Lack of cooperative tech relations makes alliance collapse. Inevitable. Venom Tova 18 technology advances born for news occasion. Need to reduce innovation. Private companies say had to NATO have major impact. Cyber interoperability. Innovation opportunity should become reluctant. Sure tech goes to elsewhere. Political and Malaysia future strategy interoperability gap of less cohesive alliance. 2. No link. The plan still leaves Article 5 in place for attacks on government infrastructure. Does not affect allied security or sovereignty. 3. The plan solves collapse. A. Sues over trust as private sector and builds trust and assurance that defense will succeed. That's Courtney. B. Setting expectations solves assurance for the goal to gear. And 21 countries remain about the role NATO should play for European partners would be eager to pull into conflict. These more frank discussion, clear expectation, hard parties are stopping the conflict rather than after trying security threats and not connected trends more focus on measures short work, conventional conflict, use allies are wrestling allies have to devise response to capabilities and toxic allies to enable to not kinetic threats, no prolif impact, it's a logical response. Nukes don't deter cyber threats, they're more likely to invest in resilience. That's Kulesa and no scenario for Europe. Prolif Tetris and 19 nuclear scenarios be taken off the table. Zero chance of German official public choice. However, Germany's not have to indigenous uranium enrichment reprocessing capabilities. Now we're thinking about French German bomb highly used French president will place a nuclear budget of partial control being stagger Obama. There's zero interest in establishing federal type union with a single executive appetite for transferring nuclear assets, infrastructure, DA, gun control threats. Peterson 320 Biden call for 20 gun laws, reviving debate on Capitol Hill, urge Congress to pass legislation, top of the agenda, contemplating executive action. Biden's jump cuts that they bring out House legislation. Biden asked if he had PC. I hope so. No link. The plan is Biden can't cast PC and a ton of executive action. Stop border crisis, tanks PC in the agenda. Zerker 319 Biden confronting political crisis. Immigration prefer focus elsewhere. Immigration potential deeper about its large use voter Finnish immigration wedge education basic executive intentions in the Democratic liberal supporters and patients and others that Biden needs to discourage migrants. Biden with multiple demands on the PC will be challenged. It won't pass. Nichols 316 parties claims that party what will Congress will struggle is missing outlines of the deal. How it would be paid for. And there's a unanimity within the parties. Progressive a bigger minority Manchester cinema voting against GNG. Both parties see the need for highways. Not much else. Biden cover corporate taxes hard to mention. Republicans who House doesn't want the gas tax. Warming measures won't be included. They said in 1NC Cross-X that it's going through normal means. Republicans are backlashing to that shit. They can't agree on funding procedures. It always derails infrastructure. No link. The plan is liked. Buttigieg pushes it, which prevents other fights. Man 3-4. Buttigieg will never program political will to pay local experience and calculate trust rights undermined by other priorities. Banking safety workshop feels Buttigieg easier to work with on infrastructure. There's no bill yet. It'll get split into pieces, so some of them will inevitably pass and others just go through reconciliation. Federal infrastructure feels no impacts. Or shows 21 for recovery and competitiveness climate. Infrastructure is part of the means that U.S. infrastructure policy taking top-down approach to Fed dictating based on insight about way lab means centers and engines prosperity. New approach must include but not responsive to needs on the ground. The act is key to solve all of the impacts. Critical infrastructure is useless without private sector cooperation and innovation. Too slow to stimulate the economy. Missile 21 infrastructure no choice. Slow moving projects take years for your already breakdown that can be deployed by federal involvement. Delay means funding not be deployed until the economy in multiple years into the recovery. Do you remember the last card I marked? I can try to finish it. Okay, that's fine.
Okay, we good?
Yeah.
All right. The Bazin and Trova evidence, where do you think that this card comes anywhere close to saying that NATO is going to collapse?
Where are we? Are we on the Prolift DA?
Prolift DA, yeah.
Risks NATO's cohesion, that's your internal link, has a major impact on interoperability among NATO, less cohesive alliance.
Collapse? Like, okay, maybe they disagree with each other. Like,
But like your link to Prolif is also like, yeah, maybe the tag says collapse, but like your link to Prolif is also weakening of alliance cohesion and a decrease in the credibility of the US security guarantee,
okay.
which the status quo is going to produce because the US.
I was more so, I don't really care about the Prolif stuff. I was more just asking about the uniqueness stuff, but it seems like you don't really have an argument there. The private sector cooperation argument. Could you just explain to me what exactly happens after the plan in terms of cooperation between NATO and private sectors?
So, like every initiative that NATO is attempting to do, like 3Ps, et cetera, innovation over tech, standards, norms, all of that stuff is impossible without, you know, a coordinate or cooperative relationship and trust between NATO and the private sector. So afterwards, they would be able to work together to improve critical infrastructure, to have, you know, redundancy, to improve their OCO capabilities.
I'm with you on the like cooperation is like all, you know, fine and dandy. I'm wondering the internal link that you've made and that you staked a lot of the counter plan on is about why reducing alliance commitments is necessary. That's sort of the part. I apologize if my question
reducing alliance commitments that cover attacks on solely private critical infrastructure. So the private sector, says Rosenblum, does not want NATO to ever activate Article 5 on attacks on critical infrastructure. And the fact that NATO is saying that it's going to do so in public statements and is planning as though it is going to be the one to defend the private sector when they would rather deal with it themselves means they're less willing to coordinate, less willing to integrate their infrastructure with NATO because they don't want to get that involved. And, you know, reducing...
Does the 1AC read a reverse causal card on that, or is the card that you just cited sort of just explains the argument?
2AC, Adams and Reese.
Where is this?
On the joint posture counterplan.
Adams and Reese. Okay.
Our leading concern is that we are unencumbered by armed attack thresholds, says private sector.
Okay. Last thing I want to ask about. You sort of made a lot of this focus on the Sony stuff, but the cards that you've read in sort of Russia deterrence and hybrid war are not just about attacks on the private sector. How does the AF solve those attacks?
So it doesn't need to, because our internal, I guess if you're which advantage, our internal link to advantage one is only about innovation, private sector innovation, and cooperation with the private sector. So the plan is not trying to stop Russia from attacking, right? Or coordinate a NATO response, right? It's only about those 3Ps and private sector innovation. So it doesn't matter that there will still be attacks on non-private infrastructure.
Why? Like, why? Innovation just prevents any attacks from mattering? Is that the argument the opposite made?
So like, we don't have to solve every scenario for a cyber attack, right? Innovation generally...
Yeah, so your solvency argument is just like, we innovate around cyber attacks.
Yes, via cooperation with the private sector, for which only attacks on the private sector matters.
649. Okay, starting.
We have 310. I'm gonna run to the bathroom real quick before sending it out. Should be sent. The order is the joint posture counter plan, the energy pick, the hostilities counter plan, advantage 1, advantage 2.
Could I get that one more time?
Yeah, the joint posture counter plan, the energy pick, the hostilities counter plan. Oh, the OCO's counter plan. I don't remember if I said that. The first advantage and the second advantage.
One more time, Arvind, because I feel like that changed something for me.
Yeah, I forgot to say the OCO's counter plan. I think that
Okay,
was what.
just say it one more time, please.
Sure. The joint posture counter plan, the energy pick, the hostilities counter plan, the OCO's counter plan, advantage 1, advantage 2. Cool. The counterpoint solves the act, establishes tiered responses to cyber and hybrid attacks, like unilaterally jettisoning the defense back and increases cooperation with the private sector that solves insurance credibility because ensures proportionate retaliation to low-level attacks, but uses the defense back as a mechanism for activation instead of relying on allied consultation. Second, I don't think they answered plank 3. Unilaterally establish a distinction between espionage and cyber attacks. There's not a single card on advantage 2 about Article 5. It's generically about cyber ethic, which the counterpoint solves by unilaterally doing it without affecting the NATO 33. Enhanced flexible response under Article 5 establishes proportional and credible return to NATO. Needs to return to the defense involving continuing response. NATO needs to extend flexible response with option responding in kind of rapid escalation of the weapons or look at the launcher because the Article 5 is covered all attack, all arms attacking. Article 5 is over this why little green will be covered if we see these actions. Article 5 the sound is trying to clear Russia be considered the interface of NATO direction 2. See what is that Article 5 is key 1 jointly clarifying thresholds for attack under Article 5 solid Jubilee 16 NATO must ensure the indestructible resilience. NATO should clearly articulate what counts under Article 5. All that's good determination would be a case by case. Russia's political no sex ever rise. Article 5 purpose imperative without NATO find itself in the geography we can alliance by clearly conveying Article 5 language. Any sensible is a trustable pair of partners for Russian hybrid attack. But it's time to sharpen NATO sword. Second joint military precise and clear responses to aggression, sharpen, deterrent, hostage, versus monolithic division, hyper warfare, that use and will, then have the will and ability to respond to conceivable the loss to test the readiness to say article of competence to use to be verification to can cope with the article 4 and have change the cabinet capable to commit through focus and frequent military exercises use never want to be in a position where only response to escalate or act with you can ensure the uncertainty command data or never call defensive attack is on attack on any attack at all any direct use reliability and counter and spell the end of the end of NATO is two is that it's key to trust. There's one, the counterpoint increases cooperation with the private sector while also trying to establish proportionate and credible responses, which will obviously increase trust with the private sector because they now know what types of responses would happen to what types of attacks, which means it would increase trust and resolve this internal link regardless of not an impact of this. Even if the private sector trusts the counterpoint a little less than the plan, there's not an impact to that occurring. 2AC3 is that the counterpoint is that the counterpoint is the status quo. No, it is not, because the counterpoint is establishing proportionate and credible responses, which is different from them just status quo asking the private sector if things are okay. 2AC4 is that there's no cohesion. There is what cohesion because the counterpoint establishes clear proportional measures, which means that all of NATO is what the private sector knows when NATO is going to respond and how NATO is going to respond. 2AC5 is that Article 5 is key. One, this card is word salad. Does it say anything? It mentions private companies and mentions the armed attack threshold, but it never puts this into a coherent argument or says that X companies do not like that Article 5 is not been clarified. It says that Sony and other attacks would be classified under Article 5 as under some definitions. It does not speak from the perspective of a private company or say that an armed attack threshold is necessary. Second, the counterpoint resolves every conceivable reason why Article 5 would be key to anticipate and prepare proportionate responses to attacks both above and below the armed attack threshold. 3, the counter plan does in fact reinterpret Article 5 by broadening the scope to more hybrid and cyber attacks. 4, limiting Article 5 fails to undermine insurance so handle the United States change declared what is better than Beijing Moscow have some uncertainty as well. The United States clearly delivered a new strategy on responsibility after defensive problem liberation. 2AC6 is that it does not solve espionage. You drop the third plank of the counterpoint, which says that we clarify a distinction between espionage and cyber war, which is sufficient to solve. There's not an Article 5 card in an advantage 2. That was 1AC cross 2AC 7 is permutation to both. 1, mutually exclusive or severance. Half limits the defense spec with the counterpoint broadens the conditions of activation to encompass nearly all cyber attacks. Second, it links to that benefit, including restriction on Article 5. Including restriction on Article 5 would spur backlash from Congress because they are against reducing alliance commitments. The counterpoint is the exact opposite of that because they increase alliance commitments. 2AC8 is permutation. Its permutation to the counterplan. 1, the plan reduces commitments by barring activation of the defense pack against critical infrastructure or private critical infrastructure. The counterplan can only increase commitments through consultation and jointly coordinating the better potential responses. Second, it picks out of conditions that are activated. The counterplan allows the condition to be activated and ensures our obligation to be non-military seal. Severance seals non-ground lead. As UK, the alliance committed the force only conditions are met to judge whether allies under the commitment because only location with the condition to activate the alliance are present. 3, defense pack requires a commitment to be I don't need that card. 2C9 is linked to that benefit. And when this card says 3 is like 6 words long and says absolutely nothing. Second, the counterplan would not link to the net benefit because it increases alliance commitments to NATO, which does not spur backlash from Congress, but they perceive it as strengthening the alliance. Whereas the AFS explicitly reduces commitments to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The energy peak kick it. We're not going for it. We'll concede there's no impact to energy war, so they don't access any of the other turns arguments. Picks bad is just a reason to reject the picks bad is just a reason to reject the argument. Hostilities counterpoint kick it. We aren't going for it. There's no offense for them here. Any new cross application justify new 2-hour responses. All theory is a reason to reject. All theory is a reason to reject the argument. The OCO's counterpoint kick it. We're not going for it. Any cross applicable solvency deficits were already answered on the other page. The private sector advantage. They do not solve any of this advantage. There's no reason that limiting Article 5 commitments would increase cooperation with the private sector. Either cooperation is wanted by the private sector, and they would just do it in the status quo because they don't necessarily care about the internal workings of NATO, or it's not good enough. Oh, I forgot conditionality. Go back to the counterpoint. Conditionality is good. 1, it's a new AF. We get to do whatever we want. It's key to Netflix because we need to be able to test AF from multiple. We need to be able to test AF from multiple angles. Second is negation theory. We only have to disprove the affirmative. It enables effective testing. 3, reasonability. Add-ons. Straight turning the net benefit, etc. Check. 4, reject the argument. And not the team 5. If they said dispo, it doesn't solve Netflix because it enables the AF to force firms out back to the private sector stuff. Second, all causes OCOs. Valentino 19 reason policy change by the Trump administration. Listening what to make any top reference more effective. These changes robot around middle office effective way to stop rebels from hacking American offensively posture. Cyber policy dangerous counterproductive undermines norms in cyberspace. They said on the OCO's counterpoint also they don't stop OCOs from occurring. Which those should be sufficient to freak out the private sector. Now, before we get into any of this, I did answer all the impacts. So do not let the 1AR blow up something as impact defense because the space defense, grid defense, and the cyber defense all apply to any sort of impact they can go. They can't use something niche down. 1, no space war. Lack 1, lack of attribution. Adversaries can never know where the collision occurred due to debris or deliberate attack. Risk aversion means uncertainty, encourage, restraint, discourage retaliation. That was on a second. Insurmountable errors, and everyone has an interest in keeping space mode. Global national political technology, the usual space weapons, very limited. Fast, massive defense, 2, undecided protect satellites, decrease usually cyber weapons, first set of errors, physical obstruction, outer space, very challenging, operating in reconnaissance satellites, orbiting terror selection, attempt to hide some capabilities in nation, trap can be quickly decked with the most weapons, looking above zero issues, utilization of weeks, physical protection, things to be light, spot, to reach the orbit and be able to withstand harsh condition. We can aid the predictability of the issue, the easy structure, no cap reactor, worst flow, space weapon, the things possible competition, and the possibility of running out of space, useless, no actors, dominant enough
prevent others to challenge any possible attempt to dominate the region. 1C2, cyber attacks won't shut down the grid. They're oversimplified the process. Even if hackers gain grid access, they can't take down the system. Since resiliency measure check, utility workers can just manually reverse grid takedown. There's no evidence that hackers even have malware that can shut down the power. That's creating evidence that also answers that cyber sabotage stuff. They try to make a distinction about second. No chance of a catastrophic grid attack, attack on the grid effects of limited doom system. The grid after the management protecting the can't take the science carry out attack the grid unit function normally. There's no evidence that attack we should have a catastrophic and probable events. FDR racing parts of the news would help protect grid attack policymakers have responded. 3, physical redundancy solves grid vulnerability and also answers any other impacts they have of technology. Gillen 16 expert grid back in the by hackers don't look at the use best defense to get the agent complexity multiple electricity also run by utilities and cooperative agent infrastructure for data protection. We have physical redundancy. There's biodiversity redundancy take out taking out so not gonna make everything come down. 1C3 the plan accelerate the scale and success of Russian hybrid operation to heighten the bar for Article 5 response to Russia to get away with more attacks without incurring retaliation. Second, specifically, taken the lack of consensus toward the case completely standards produced unclear thresholds on deterrent surgeries. 16 years when Article 5 was really known to be declared coming from Russia. Several members of the 31 country laws would less than reach just locally county control may not be seen in Brussels or check all this trend of the long amendment which if the elements kind of green hybrid warfare the hard to short defend can Article 5 be called on history of the beautiful guy the ICA said included the arms up. A group started the state has effective control over them. 4, and the AF produces reluctance to invoke Article 5 early in a crisis. The wait and see approach complicates crisis escalation management later. More economy 19 versus what Latvia and Lithuania asking for Western as long as possible. System with elementary credits are significantly complicated escalation management. The place to get the tools of conflict early in various possibility of so discord among allies trucks inevitably backfired. They said it's not a credible response that was answered above. Russia does perceive it as credible. Some ambiguity is good. It does solve any of the corporate sort of infrastructure stuff. Anything that is not solved by this is obviously solved by the counter with the espionage advantage at the top. Russia's trying to say no norms to galation. No the papers for days and time to hit the robot 2017 when it failed. There was a release against not going to be part of the failure. Description of norms leading to militarization spies on the fact of the US. Now particularly happens China, the Russian self-defense international national security. These have shifts in cyber section with election regulation, which is a different harder problem to solve. Second, they don't solve any of this advantage. Not a single card is about Article 5. You can't change each government's definition of a cyber espionage or an attack, which means they cannot broadly solve any of the sort of norms that link stuff. Now, extend 1C1, no cyber war countries are restrained. They won't risk the consequence of escalation. Second, evidence is high brain 14, hyper exaggeration, organization would get more from the way aircraft once you're the damage to the grids and from separate national causes, of course, entries of the tree winds and heavy nerves and production of the hyper justified examples by cyber warfare. Others more natural internet zones you make it very hard to inflict widespread damages. 3, deterrence checks ran for the deterrence work the retaliation will keep the bad actors protect them. Or that's what make it only smaller reasons keep mining vulnerability not to have closed it off. Nation will have knowledge and intuition to support determine opponents and make sure limit all of cyber war damage except practice on a scale that jeopardizes security and economic survival requires expansive technical capabilities and impressive concentration of extra active with the ability of national governance all corporation actions on legal trust to counter-strike. 1C2 no Russia war. Russia has no intent. Putin is set on destroying the war but rather preserving its logical economy. Second, ongoing cooperation of the NATO lines would be able to check. 1C3 no China war. Neither side wants it. Neither country regards each other as their principal enemy. Leaders and bureaucracy in both countries don't want conflict and won't escalate even major disputes. It's driven by lack of explicit preparation for. Second, global factors, economic independence, mutually assured destruction, greatly decrease the risk of appetite for leaders and prep miscalculation.
We're gonna take prep for a second.
Sure.
Okay, we have 6:23. Are you good, Arvind?
Yeah.
So you say that the counterplan distinguishes between espionage and cyber attacks. What is the distinction that the counterplan establishes?
I don't think that's particularly important. It just has the U.S. unilaterally declared a distinction. That's the internal link to your second advantage, so that's more than sufficient to solve. The 2AC also did not make an answer.
Besides, you can't just
The
go.
AF doesn't wait. The AF also does not like specify some distinction, so it's like largely irrelevant. It would just be the United States unilaterally declaring it.
It's like the AF says the distinction is that one is an armed attack and one is not an armed attack. It is not an act of war. What does the counterplan say the distinction is?
We don't need to specify that distinction, just that there is one.
Like, what does that even mean? So how do we treat them?
Your evidence, like all your internal link evidence on that advantage, none of it is about Article 5 or making a distinction within the NATO treaty. It has the US unilaterally declare that it believes that things to be true.
It's because it's about saying that it is not an armed attack, i.e. it therefore does not activate Article 5 because it is not an act of war. Does the
That's not
counterplan-
you do not have a card that says you need to make an Article 5 distinction. We just have to unilaterally declare that there is a difference between espionage and then other forms of cyber attacks.
Okay,
As
so
long as
does
that
the-
distinction is made clear, that's more than sufficient to solve.
Arvind, does the counterplan unilaterally declare that cyber espionage is not an armed attack?
Unilaterally declare, yes, we don't affect Article 5 or the NATO
I
treaty.
understand you think you affect Article 5, but does the counterplan unilaterally say that the US will not anymore classify cyber espionage as an armed attack?
The United States, like, do you mean it's just the United States doing it? Yes, if that's your question.
Yes. The US doesn't think cyber espionage is an armed attack. Then how could it activate Article 5 if Article 5
It could
says-
activate Article, hold up. It could activate Article 5 because we don't change conditions of activation. It would discuss a type of response that we could provide to a certain like espionage or attack, which means it doesn't need.
For activation is that it is an armed attack. I feel like we're going in circles. It's just like, I don't know if we read the text of Article 5 is I think the point of this process. Your arguments for why it solves advantage 1, it's very difficult to tell based on this 2NC whether you think it solves any of the internal links about public sector coordination or whether you just think it solves the terminal impact of cyber attacks.
I think both.
Okay, like obviously you're going to say that,
You want
but
me
I
to-
think it solves the former.
The private sector part? Well,
Yeah.
the counterplan, after, I guess, establishing graduated response, it would increase cooperation with the private sector.
And
None
do
of
you-
your Article 5 evidence is about clarifying a threshold for activation. It is
Well-
about just knowing what constitute a response for Article 5 attacks. Or
Well, that's false.
things that
It seems
activate
like
Article
this whole process, you've been just blatantly just asserting false assertions about our evidence
That's
without
not
actually saying what
true.
you think the counterplan does.
That's not true. I did say what the counterplan does. I said the counterplan changes response type. It does not change the conditions of activation.
Changes response type, but do you have a card that means the private sector will be more willing to work with NATO?
Yeah, I think we do. I think our evidence says that if we clarify thresholds, that would be more than sufficient to get the private sector on board. And you don't have a card that differentiates those things either.
I don't have a single card that says that.
The order is the prolific DA and then politics. And it is sent. Uh-oh. Okay. We all good? Yeah. If not, could anyone stop me in the next 5 seconds or so? Great. 2AC has no warming defense. The 1 AR shouldn't get some either. Foreign causes extinction, acidification, extreme weather, food and water scarcity, biodiversity shocks makes. Oh, I said I'm starting on Prolif. I'll get there later. I'm sorry. I'll just do Prolif now. 2AC1 concede. We're not the alliance collapse inevitable card. It doesn't say collapses alliance. At best they win alliance cohesion. Not our argument. The concede no Prolif impact. That was 2AC 5 through 6. Politics DA. I'm sorry, I gave my wrong order. The warming impact, causes extinction, acidification, extreme weather, food and water scarcity, biodiversity shocks makes Earth uninhabitable. 2, it outweighs the status quo. The status quo war, shortage, conflict, cause or create conflict sparks that go nuclear due to existential pressure on states. That's grow evidence. 3, that weighs on magnitude comes first because of irreversibility and incalculable value based on future lives. McDonald 19 nuclear change does not result in apocalyptic loss of life. Nuclear winter that they base the shaky foundation, no reliable model that can determine how many magnetic times that make human extinct in the nations already done in 2000. When in nuclear devices, humans can survive and recover from war. Even nuclear one, humans cannot recover from runaway climate change, nuclear wars, and the inevitable extinction event. The warming is 4, probability off-ramps exist every running the escalation ladder, but you can't negotiate with the environment. 5, warming collapses alliances. While 18 climate change rolls the DP by 10%, the cost of it runs in hundreds of billions, but the cost of it put enormous pressure on reducing budget. The maintain defense budget is going to be impossible for saving people to protect the allies and going to the shelf line by line. 2AC1 gun control thumper. Gun control is the Democrats' usual fox or a call to action. Hugging and Cornell and 323 such future project. The Senate would do more. They did not give time for legislation adopted. The Senate did not talk on innovation. 2, their evidence is rhetorical bluster. Guns are on the agenda. Bulletin 323 should not have said this book. the White House and the balls against the balls against both Democratic leaders didn't the floor general the president of Senator Sean Africa the legislation coming floor said that a whole lot of things would go. Want to do we have you by personally that's being talked about to AC2 the link debate reducing alliance commitments Rex political capital Biden is forced suspended to convince hawkish Republicans and liberal internationalist Democrats treaty changes and commitment renegotiations in particular spark congressional backlash especially proven by the Korean troop referral on Taiwan defense pact abrogation needed just asserts Biden. Not sure what the argument here was. If they tried to cross-apply something, they said secret on one of the other pages or Rapu evidence is specific says that secret fails, gives the example of Carter who tried to remove troops from the NDT but it still caused congressional backlash. Second, Biden is gaining PC by increasing alliance commitments that the plan up and that's Matt Millman and 20 Biden through an office to domestic policy but it is on agenda mentioned saying this has the opportunity to put forth the alliance that they can become partners in force that he plans to restore American relations to the allies that build political capital. 3, undermining alliances trades off with Biden bipartisanship reduced to 1 doing despite hostilities Biden remains delivering bipartisan wisdom that working relationship with Republicans advocated America's role as a leader after Trump alienated allies. 4, the plan undermines Biden's current alliance initiatives to gain PC Biden hearted and join Trump understanding the fact that Biden opportunity to rebuild alliances. Biden teams can turn massive leads in political capital. Get things done. The last 4 years served as warming unilateralism. Newfound energy should be harnessed by Biden. Early Biden decisions like during rejoining Paris Asia go a long way. 5, reducing alliance commitments cost PC. Robinson 4 17 Trump spending political capital to reduce defense solution declared ET. Case of Trump's doing being too erratic to go Trump's desired NATO accelerated plans about the way the alliance is already plans to have political capital. 6, the plan triggers a harsh congressional backlash. It's a 180 from Biden's NATO and cyber stances. In 20 he made an instruction has a lot of ties. New president undermining the alliance has important role. Biden called for an opponent into the world to counter will keep the alliance capability sharp will extend the not sure so that's the cyber US policy for Russia gets on the new administration. Russia will bipartisan consensus in Congress. 7, the Congress supports unconditional Article 5 in 19. One thing the bipartisan supports NATO and vacation commitment to NATO Republican House the reduction to reaffirm Article 5 of their charge consider which are mobilizing bipartisan support leaders of both parties suggested there's deep bipartisan support. 2 AC3 the executive immigration. First, there's no bill cited here. It just says that there's some confusion over immigration. 2, no thumpers. Top of the agenda. Lisa 323 infrastructure week is coming. Real Biden is legislative budget and infrastructure. The our cycle before talking about the focus on fair fact of appealing to Republicans and moderate Democrats given bipartisan. But 2, everything is priced in. And 2, Biden's political planning. Only the plan is a bolt from the blue that forces him to reorganize priorities. Franchise 1 18 Biden focuses on COVID and the economy. The Biden sticks to infrastructure climate policy changes are going to say away Obama's which is not just like the focus policies all becoming news. Biden will proposal COVID unreal infrastructure incorporating priorities over climate then will come taxes for which state are practical just as other priorities remain elusive. Economy lags ready for Senate majorities mean Biden will put all these absent opportunities are restricted to AC4. Won't pass stuff when it passes now. Biden is spending PC to rally support for that's the primary drive for economic recovery and climate resilience. That's the liaison evidence. Second, link control structure of uniqueness. It's inherently uncertain how day-to-day congressional actions implicate Biden's political planning, but the plan is a bolt from the blue that upends the congressional agenda. 3, their evidence is old from 2 weeks ago. 4, Biden it will pass. Biden is using PC. Democrats getting bored with pulley from today. The Democrats are confident that they will back to fund infrastructure. To lay out the more details that the negotiation the Capitol expects to dominate the political agenda. Our citizens for merchant for 9 feel certainty help that unanimous support among Democrats are growing. Mention that's what NBC enormous package Biden hopes to build momentum, big house popularity. Is looking good. Biden still in that is back. 5 passes now. PC is key to RC 323. Biden's point together package to boost the economy, reduce emissions, generate infrastructure. Biden presents proposal congressional leaders as well as being an outreach scope that highlights aggressive approach. Why Biden wants 1.9 trillion package that's a little against the longer economic choice, linking to new energy. Biden the legislative digest the majority of the Democrats hold the focus of the influential Republicans, business leaders, and moderate Democrats the infrastructure. The get and spending on 2AC 5 is 2AC 4 is that I think it's 4 warming won't get included. Yes, it will. Kessler 11 6 growing the main chief speculated Biden would be among the most expensive enter the House of good terms with Republican leaders. Departments that fully understand the equation that Congress would like to focus on clean energy, ambitious president underpin negotiations in Congress if possible, and congressional. I don't need that card. 2AC5. The sort of Buttigieg passes it. Biden PC is key. Trustee turn it. 2AC Biden says the bipartisan meetings members of the infrastructure return to traditional meetings expect to make it regular. Biden's better to put people together for the issue. Bipartisan contests requiring presidential knowledge and political capital. That said, Republicans from the beginning to normalize talking with them how policy make it work. Trade Senate had Biden plan to ask for confident Republicans draw contest with Trump to with the House of Republicans support infrastructure policy. Biden is well positioned to do that. Their piece of evidence even says that Biden is necessary. Biden's success is necessary. 2AC6, the reconciliation stuff. Biden will only do it with Republican support. Less than 3, 23 getting Republican votes are politically necessary. Biden promises working event to restore political working day. Their promises to the voters and suburbs make differences between victory and defeat. Biden revealed how important voters are ballots. The agenda. Democrats will need Republican voters hanging there. Tiny majorities. How Biden gets a passing proposal made wins them or not. The 2AC7, the infrastructure fails. This card says climate once, infrastructure solves. 3 minutes. C323. Biden's rebuilding infrastructure for climate change spending. Also, the economy building the emissions accelerating clean energy part of the plan. Electric vehicle stationing emissions and electric vehicles, housing advanced manufacturing, messaging underlying the climate market. Climate Act doesn't solve it, and innovation. They have no warrant for why innovation solves the warming stuff. We're not going for the econ impact. Did I finish this card? Or yeah, this card is marked at climate. The
I had an underlying message. A little bit before.
Sure, fair enough.
Yeah, but I was following along, Mark. I had everything marked.
I'll send out that version.
Okay, cool.
We have 6:23.
All right.
Okay, we stopped it at 1:55. I'm just gonna grab water.
right. It is the espionage advantage, the private sector advantage, the flexible response kind of plan, and then infrastructure just said. All right. Is everybody good?
No, Nick's saying
Yeah,
no.
no, I'm not starting. Sweet. Everybody else good? Okay, cool. Limiting out espionage prevents overreactions to Chinese threats and also prevents adversaries from using a justification to move to cyber sabotage. The group, the first two arguments, saying no to norms doesn't matter. The first part of the advantage is about NATO and the U.S. overreaction. And the second scenario is that China will be angry at the U.S. when they realize that the U.S. is a hypocrite about their espionage rules. Nothing has to do with whether or not China follows on the cyber war impact. Yes, cyber war, it's not a hype. Their evidence isn't predictive of a move away from espionage to sabotage, which obviously we agree with is the status quo. Deterrence can't check because of there's a high reward to damaging NC3 because it takes out nuclear weapons. The concede there's no impact to Russia. It takes out first what the counterplan solves because it's just a question of setting standards. Second, we're only going for the NATO, the NATO 3. We're just going for the NATO 3P scenario that involve, like for example, a Chinese hack. Third, we can still go for the China impact. And fourth, if we can see that Putin's not expanding, which it definitely takes out the deterrence they set on the other advantage because it means that it takes out the deterrence they set on the other advantage because it means that there's no way that he would expand and they don't have any LAO impacts. Yes.
The impact because the only impact was U.S.
Yeah,
Russia.
the only impact was U.S.-Russia war. Anyways, the China impact defense. China has the intent to do so now. They're a rising power when we pissed off in response to a bunch of Americans' espionage attacks. The private sector advantage, private cooperation with NATO is key to one. AI norms. AI norms. That's gives the NATO and other Western allies massive military advantages over other countries like China. Second is grid. It collapses civilization. Otherwise, every sector of the economy shuts down. No access to food, water, etc. Third, space. Often it's an offense dominant domain. If concerns of a hack trigger use or lose treasures because satellites are critical to nuclear weapons. All causes are irrelevant. The private sector isn't worried about things like OCOs. Yes, the attribution is irrelevant. It makes it more likely that accidents will happen. The barriers argument is untrue. ASATs, missiles, stalkers, etc. are all possible. MAD doesn't solve for the same reason. Cyber, the grid defense is incorrect. Resiliency fails, especially in a world where the private sector isn't sharing information. The physical redundancy is incorrect. Terrorists can still use bombs. That's the status quo. The flexible response. Doesn't solve any of the third plank is completely irrelevant. It definitely means it links in that benefit. Doesn't solve advantage 2, which is about ruling out cyber operations from being an armed attack. Merely creating a distinction between the two things does nothing because the liminal and U evidence say that we need to clarify that espionage isn't an active war. That's key to prevent escalatory responses by the U.S. and other countries. If the counterplan distinguishes between the two by saying that espionage is not an armed attack, it links to every disad and permitted the counterplan is no longer severance because it's not an armed attack under Article 5. They also don't solve advantage 1. First, they're deploying our advantage is about preventing cyber attacks when it's about increasing innovation with the private sector through NATO 3P. The counterplan doesn't do anything about this. Second, trust is key. The private sector hates Article 5 activation and it won't work with NATO if it's on the table. They want to deal with attacks themselves. It's a coordinate evidence. The 2AC card is fantastic, saying that the private sector specifically asked for clarification on armed attack thresholds. Third, they don't solve the innovation race impact for sure, even if you think they solve the terminal impacts of cyber war. The impact is about NATO 3P and collaborative innovation to win the tech race and conceded the terminal impact. Permutation to both solve the link and benefit. If we win that NATO allies don't care about limiting our private sector attacks, the counterplan looks like it's recommitting to them. The infrastructure just said no turns case. 2 arguments. First, no part of the act requires alliances. It's a question of cooperation and having information from the private sector. For second, it's way too long term. It requires warming, creating devastating consequences, which won't happen for centuries. Which definitely won't happen for centuries. The gun control, the gun control thumper. Their evidence is horrific. It says that Biden and Schumer are not on the same page now, which definitely fractures democratic unity and proves our argument. Biden will push it. That's Pinkelton and 325. The ban and trust the governor from the Biden about they got Congress. They admittedly passed legislation. This and a battle forward. It seems familiar with Biden himself seeking to drive the change. Also, there's an infrastructure thumper. The border crisis drains Biden's PC and it's for his broader agenda. It's diverting focus and political resources to fend off attacks from both parties. That's their true evidence. It creates massive fights over infrastructure no matter what. That's Spurge and 319. The immigration efforts that are in the White House at immigration and infrastructure bill through reconciliation. The bypass of Republicans the most controversial. What it causes political fires from the affecting immigration especially with President Biden's best chances. Biden, we're committed to build our support for immigration first, but advocates are pressing reconciliation. It blows up the agenda in April before the that's Serio and 317 Dems have not yet decided the next legislative approach when the Assembly returns in April. The Dems could decide to instead of address immigration given the surge of the border. The CAF is Congress, which means that even if Biden still does it, it means that he doesn't have to push it, which means he doesn't use PC. It doesn't matter if people in Congress might get angry. He's not using his political capital to get it through the 2AC. The 1R doesn't answer this. What?
The won't pass.
Yeah, the bill definitely won't pass. There isn't a bill now, and they've explained that this is requiring the GOP. They definitely won't do it. They won't agree on a funding mech. That's Ellison 323 tax increase that fell short. Well, should mean the government would have to borrow tax credits would add another trillion raising avenues. We trust held and leave fields who's the deputy. The biggest hurdle is the Republicans. McConnell when referring to a Trojan horse from essential stems such as Manchin would make it tougher deficits. Manchin said infrastructure should be entirely paid for. The GOP will never agree. That's Rand Paul in 318. Heads I win until you use Republicans warning to for infrastructure. They've been demonstrated while paying for the Republicans will accuse them of running up the death. The Republicans are prevalently accused of the Trojan horse tax. Infrastructure will finance that can be financed by revenue. Democrats will push for a common component that derails. That's Cusick and 120. Biden's also about to push for infrastructure that traditionally taxed bipartisan support. They're unclear whether Biden will make it his top priority. The Democracy infrastructure intertwined with common emphasis not allowed to erode GOP support. The Buttigieg answer argument does not go well handed by the 1R. He pushes infrastructure, not Biden's his pet project, and he can maintain a relationship with Congress despite other distractions, even if Biden does it too. Buttigieg pushed and avoids controversy. This early in 319 fix it first. Appointment Buttigieg is the closest far better than debating skill among secretaries that sense important single Buttigieg demonstrated ability to get policies on the most non-controversial issues. Biden's PC isn't key. That's just one 1-5 will. Buttigieg will have to convince lawmakers back to infrastructure that Buttigieg could help win in rural areas. The messenger does not hurt any. They'll have to go through committee capital. The top Republican members good consensus bill. The bill fails. It's a question of if the funding for climate actually happens. State solved and the Fed fails. It's Miller 19 Congress. Well, every time while rising to the infrastructure problems, the metaphor worse. The story is mentioned the world there is no conceivable federal program to stop the funding with infrastructure. Mark that with infrastructure.
We have 310.
310. Yeah.
The order is the politics decide, the joint posture counter plan, advantage 1, advantage 2. Is everybody good to go? Okay. Warming outweighs on magnitude. It's the only existential risk via acidification, extreme weather, food scarcity, and biodiversity. Scott, feedback loops make it more likely in the F. Magnitude first, they drop nuclear war does not cause extinction, which means warming is the only existential risk. We can negotiate our way out of any war, but not the environment. It turns case because rising temperatures create instability that sparks wars, and it collapses the alliance system because it obliterates the budget, which means NATO cannot efficiently do anything or organize cyber thresholds. Look, because they have dropped that nuclear war does not cause extinction, that means we can bounce back from any of the AF's impact. We cannot bounce back if the entire environment dies, which means that the DA should outweigh, even if you were skeptical of some of the sort of stuff. Too one is that it doesn't turn the case because the plan doesn't require cooperation. The plan breaks down cooperation because NATO can no longer be efficiently funded. Given that we've taken step away from the environment. 2 they said it is long term. It is not long term. Extreme weather events are happening now, and feedback loops mean the process accelerating. But even if it is long term, you drop it. See only existential impact extinction confirmed because of because of the infinite quantity of future generation. 2 is that gun control thumps. Look, every single one of these gun control thumper cards just says one line where Biden was in a press conference saying, "Oh, we should do something on guns." This is the Democrats' fall call to action after every single shooting. They never actually do anything. Or first piece of evidence says that there is nothing on the agenda. It cites Schumer and Biden and says they have not agreed on anything or putting it on agenda. Our second piece of evidence says they have not put it up to a vote and they are not going to do so. All of their cards are just rhetorical. Plus, they're the same thing Democrats do after every single shooting. Second is the framing issue for all the other thumper arguments you dropped. Every single one of them is priced into Biden's political planning, which means only the plan is a bullet from the blue that upends his sort of agenda. The next argument about immigration is that immigration is not happening now. Infrastructure week has started. That was our piece of evidence that Nick read in the 1NR, which means that immigration does not sap any PC. Also, what is the immigration PC argument? There is not a bill happening now. Their card saying it's gonna happen. It's gonna happen in April from 2 weeks ago. Northwestern, you should have done your politics work this week instead of 2 weeks ago. In the last month, all of their cards are too old to account for any of our factors. We read cards from today saying infrastructure is going to happen now, which means there is not a risk of any thumpers. The next argument about Biden does have to push. Biden does have to push. Do you understand the thesis of political capital? Given that you have dropped the entire leak debate because they dropped its massive alliance reductions, guaranteed congressional backlash. The plan caused Biden PC because he has to convince hawkish Republicans and liberal internationalist Democrats to get on board. Empirics demonstrate that reducing alliance with PC, that's one to wrap. In particular, the plan crushes bipartisan necessary to pass infrastructure. They've also continued the plan is a 180 on Biden's cyber policy towards NATO, which requires him to pass PC and derails infrastructure. Project reinterpretation of the plan. If they want to spec agent, put it in the plan. Otherwise, it's a reactive mode of clash. I don't really know what their argument can be here. The next argument is that the funding mechanism is being resolved. And also, this explanation was new in the 1AR, so you should not give them anything. The next argument is that there's not a funding mechanism. There is a funding mechanism. That is what Biden is spending political capital on. He's trying to get support for tax increases. Biden has PC to get it done now and get Republicans on board, but the plan derails that from sort of happening. They say the GOP won't agree. Yes, they will. Our evidence is most recent from today and a card from 323, which says the GOP is getting on board now because infrastructure is a bipartisan priority, which means that there's sort of things which means they would be willing to get things done. Their card about them not wanting to support climate deals or their analytic about them not supporting climate deals is unsubstantiated. They also drop the sort of arguments about the climate provisions. They underestimate the likelihood of passage. They can get GOP on board because they do support sort of clean energy initiative. The next argument about Buttigieg, this doesn't make any freaking sense. Buttigieg is a transportation secretary, so obviously Biden is coordinating political capital with him, but that does not mean that there are uniquely different, distinct amounts of political capital being used on them. We've also read evidence that says that Biden is the one pushing political capital. He's the only one that has leverage with Republican senators. Even if Buttigieg is helping out, this is not a takeout to the DA. It just means that Biden is using his transportation secretary to help. The next card about Biden not being key says absolutely nothing. Biden is key. That was our sort of argument, our sort of card from the 1NR. Finally, they say that states solve warming. This is a wholly new argument. Scratch it from your flow. It's also from 2019. Does not assume the political climate. Infrastructure is key to solve climate. The bill updates infrastructure with clean energy and climate resilience to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. The one is Anderson or one of Friedman says the bill would reduce emissions, accelerate clean energy, energy efficient housing. That is necessary to solve warming, which means even if the states are key, the federal funding is necessary to get it done. Joint project counterplan kicking. We're not going for it. No new cost applications. There's no other office on this one. The private sector advantage. OCOs
take out the impact. Nina explicitly said they allow for them to continue all the other counterpoint, those undermined but private co-op and norms with Russia and China. Ballerino says it obviously over-oriented cyber policy is dangerous, counterproductive, and otherwise norms that spies raise no space war impact, lack of attribution to attack means states are risk averse and won't miscalculate. It is not an offensive dominant domain. States stay restrained because they have an incentive to use space peaceful as McDonnell Evans or Dobos evidence that there's no utility in space weapons. Physical obstruction makes space impossible to operate in. No one wants to compete in space. These take out any of their sort of next-gen tech impacts because the same principles apply. The units of architecture make space less likely to initiate a conflict. No impact to the grid. Or Craig says they're oversimplifies the process. They extended the terminal impact to grid, not that cyber attacks don't cause a grid collapse. Hackers gaining access to systems don't allow them to trigger blackouts. This resiliency measure can be deployed by utility workers to solve the issue. Our Fisher evidence says that governments exaggerate the magnitude of the impact. Hackers lack the technology necessary for attacking. They dropped that. Gillen evidence which says the physical redundancies to be able to solve for it. Not going for the turn turn. No Russian defense takes out any sort of other hybrid impacts at all. Any sort of hybrid impact because there's no terminal impact escalation, the espionage advantage. All this norm stuff takes out advantage one because that's what they explain as the internal link. Russia and China would say no, which means there's no reason empirically proven by things in 2017, which means there were no escalation, no cyber impact. Or Ballerino evidence says that countries are restrained. They don't want to risk the consequence of escalation. Mutually assured destruction does apply in the cyberspace, which means nobody uses nuclear weapons, even if it does cause some escalation. Or Rain evidence highlights indicts their studies and said they sort of exaggerate the threat to be able to get excessive military budgets. Or second rate evidence says that the threat of retaliation and mutually assured destruction does apply in cyberspace, and they are sort of wrong about any sort of escalation. Finally, no U.S.-China war. Neither country regards them each other as a principal enemy. Leaders, bureaucracy, deterrence, internet, economic check. Even if there are minor cyber attacks, they would never escalate to a hot war because global factors as well as empirics like the EP3 collision prove that no one would ever want to escalate to a conflict. And they said that resilience measures on the other page, they said that resilience measures fail. No, they do not, because the grid is segmented, which means there is no sort of risk of escalation. There is no terminal impact that they are winning at the end of the debate. Even if a nuclear war does occur, they have dropped nuclear war doesn't cause extinction. Nina should not get any new impact framing against the extinction first framing. Future generations comes first. They do not get any new impact arguments. It doesn't matter how good the 2AR is. Tim did not say any of it in the 1AR.
Sorry.
155.
Just thought it looked pretty cool. Advantage 1, advantage 2, D8. Just closing out of some docs so this doesn't crash on me, because that would suck. Okay. Everyone's here. Okay, good. You cannot go for for DA in the case when the mayor made it explicitly clear that throughout the entirety of the debate, the negative has dropped the innovation race impact in the 1AC. The Murray evidence says the cooperation with the private sector is necessary to win the innovation race so that Western liberal values are established over technology, IoT, 5G, cyberspace, benefits, 3D printing, etc. All promise benefits, but also carry downside risks. If the authoritarian governments, if autocracies win the tech race, that means that the technology will turn on creators. It results in extinction. 3D printing is used by rogue states. It spurs arms racing and then prolif. It is the most deadly impact, but democratic innovation over norms such as possible only with private sector input solves the upside to all of these impacts and affirmatively solves innovation that resolves every terminal impact. The one air on the DA explicitly flagged this as solving the terminal impact to warming because innovation is the only way that gets us there. They have no defense against this, so you cannot vote none a risk of the DA over it. It turns the DA. One, don't evaluate the terminal impact first because the case is huge and they do not have defense to this particular scenario. The DA is tiny because they cannot solve warming. The status quo cannot solve warming if there is no warming provision included in the bill, and they have card 0 that says the GOP would ever vote for an infrastructure bill that does anything related to green financing. Second, it solves warming. That one air explicitly solves this, and the terminal impact turns it, even if not causes extinction itself. Nuclear war would destroy the ozone and cause warming much more than the status quo would. Now, whether or not I definitely get to read a card right now that says nuclear war causes extinction. One, the one in our tagged a card, warming outweighs on magnitude. They did not say nuclear war does not cause extinction. This is a completely new articulation of the argument in the 2 and R. 2, we explicitly said all of our arguments cause extinction in the 1 air, and even if you don't think that it causes extinction, you know that it turns their impact before the impact could never turn the DA. Okay, I'm going to read one now. It does. Con 18 Nibna, Solomon Gore, toss 11 billion due to the abstract sphere, so major string reactions that will reflect a running planning nuclear war to cause crop failure or famous society ceases this, that we have no right to gamble because of lose or not. Let anyone get another chance. You cannot vote on this tiny thing because the 1 and R did not say the words nuclear war does not cause extinction. This is the worst form of debate. What? They hide tiny arguments within evidence. It's impossible for us to read every line of every card and then blow it up based on things that the 1 and R did not even explicitly flag. We definitely turn the impact, and there's no defense to our impact. The risk of this DA is so tiny and so stupid that I'll go there now. None of their defense on the private sector advantage applies. OCOs doesn't take out our internal link about private sector cooperation, trust, and innovation. Don't do that work for them. Space weapons, fine. No cyber impact. We're not going for it. And it's not about 3D printing. And then AI, the stuff on the espionage advantage also doesn't apply. No terminal impact doesn't assume a tech race where China is more likely to intervene and aggressively attack the U.S. They could go nuclear with any country. Our evidence is also about rogue states. So that's also terminal. Don't cross-apply any of this for them because they dropped it, and the 1 air made it extremely explicit like 3 times. Okay, the DA, the negative does not have a single piece of evidence that says the GOP will sign onto a bill that it raises revenue through taxes, that raises revenue through deficit spending, that does tax and doesn't have any evidence that says the Democrats will do tax cuts. There is no way to fund this bill. The reason that infrastructure can't get through Congress, even though it's hypothetically bipartisan and has always failed, is because you can't actually get it across the aisle. What 10 senators are going to cross ranks when they've proven they're not willing to do that with reconciliation? They have only read evidence that says that Biden would like it to be bipartisan and that they're trying, but not a single piece of conclusive evidence that says the GOP and the Dems can include on funding provisions. That is always what breaks infrastructure, the fight over how to fund it. Our 1 air evidence says that tax increase, heads I win, tails you lose, gambles from the GOP. They say that they're willing to do it because they like to posture in the media, but when it comes down to it, they're both refusing to deficit fund and refusing to fund it via taxes. So there is no compromise that is even conceivable, and the 2 and R does not say the reconciliation is a possible way that this bill could get passed. Now, the 1 air also does read a card. It's a structural uniqueness argument, so it doesn't matter how long ago it was that says that the GOP will never agree to funding over climate provisions. They think this is a Trojan horse to sneak in the Green New Deal. It would look absolutely horrible for them, and 10 of the most uncompromising people in all of Capitol Hill would have to cross that line to compromise. They have no evidence that says that would happen, even if you think there is a small risk of it. The thumpers overwhelm this by so much. We have evidence that says gun control is the top of the agenda from 2 days ago. Biden is contemplating executive actions, which thump the link even if he doesn't push it through Congress, because the 2 and R concedes the F is not Congress, and their only articulation of the link is that Biden has to convince people to vote for the plan, which does not make sense when the 1 R says it is only executive action. Our Plinkington evidence says Biden called on Congress to immediately pass legislation for gun control and immigration. The DA, it takes it out. They say the infrastructure is top of the agenda now. There's not even a bill drafted. How could it be top of the agenda? They're doing negotiations now, but we don't even have a bill written. This will tank the agenda before September, which the 1AR evidence also says. Buttigieg pushes it deflects crisis over PC. Even if they have cards that say Biden PC is good for convincing people, Buttigieg can also do it. So even if Biden PC is set back for a couple of weeks or months, by the time the vote actually happens, none of that matters. Now, warming doesn't answer all of it about that, does not turn or impact what collapses alliance systems. That doesn't make any sense. Why does it collapse? NATO 3Ps, nuclear war not cause extinction was topped above. You also can't evaluate Turns case without the DA because they have no evidence that anything in this bill is possible now. Gun control thumper does draw controversy in PC. If the link is only about controversy, then their answer to the immigration thumper is there's no bill. Okay, there's no fucking infrastructure bill. So how would that make sense? An infrastructure bill isn't going to happen until September. Link is massive. Argument is about it being Congress. They say their evidence is recent, but all of it is aspirational. Just saying the administration has released guidelines over infrastructure in hopes it will be bipartisan. 10. Who are the 10? Ask yourself that question because there have to be 10 for certain who cross the line. And there are 0, not 10, 0. Good debate, Dartmouth.
Yay,
debate.
headache. Yay, we have to decide this. Yay, great debate.
Hey, before all the judges take off, is everyone okay streaming the RFDs, or would you prefer I stop the stream?
You can stream your RFD. I don't care. I don't care.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Hey, everybody, our decision is in.
Well,
Liam, do you want to refresh yours and confirm that that's correct? I was the last person, so.
I think you're right. Hey, William, are you live streaming? Are you okay? Is this all okay? Or whatever, we can announce whenever.
Bill, are we good to, yeah, I don't think it matters. Okay, so great debate. Round 8, prelims are over. Good job. The decision was a 3-0 for the affirmative. Okay, so I voted F on the advantage outweighs a pretty low risk of the disad. I don't think it's controversial to say that the F wins the innovation race scenario. For me, it's just a question of does the disad outweigh that? So in terms, I start with uniqueness. It just makes sense to start there in this debate to me. So in terms of the F evidence, I think it's really good that there's on the question that there's no Republican support for increasing taxes, for more deficit spending, or for anything even related as a Green New Deal. And they've got this like really big fear that the Green New Deal is just like hiding in this hypothetical bill that might exist. The negatives evidence, I think the 1NC evidence definitely says that support is shaky because they don't know how they're going to pay for it yet. And there's a part of the 1NC evidence that says, is it even possible to get GOP folks on board? I also, the one in our evidence furthermore says that whoever it's citing is like, I'm confident there will be a bill sometime, maybe this fall. And so a couple of things, like this matters a lot because I think the F's uniqueness evidence is just better. And also the delay issue is relevant in terms of the thumper. So the negative evidence is just not as specific as the affirmative evidence. And before I explain the thumper situation, I will say though that I wish that the F was better at picking apart this evidence because I don't feel super happy. Like that's probably why I was last is just I kept reading evidence and being like, I'm seeing so many things that no one is really talking about, but I'll just read all the F and all the neg evidence, I guess, and compare them because that's where we're at. So in terms of the thumpers, their evidence, the delay evidence that the negative evidence concede matters a lot because the F, one of their immigration cards says that Republicans are currently weaponizing the immigration situation to derail Biden's agenda. And that's like a super important argument. Was this explained A+ in the 2AR? No, but the 2NR also was insufficient in answering it. So I think that it's like an argument that they can have and win. Also, I'm just in a conundrum here in terms of what we're doing with the thumper situation. So the negatives answers to both gun control and immigration are like, but these aren't bills yet. But like infrastructure isn't a bill yet. Thus, you know, if you get like the thesis of the dissent, then I think that you have to treat these thumpers as like legitimate arguments and answer them. And the gun control evidence that they read is great. It literally says it's at the top of the agenda. Plus there's no way that it could have been priced in to Biden's agenda because like those mass shootings just happened, which again would be an awesome thing for the AF to say. Which leads me to the impact, which I think is just like so much less relevant at this point because I think that the AF is ahead on all of those things. Warming, it's got to be at least somewhat long-term, right? Like we can't pretend it happens immediately. And wars would definitely exacerbate it. So I think that the advantage turns to dissent is the most persuasive argument. I thought the 1NR card was sneaky, but probably fine. Like I'm not really against it, but you do need to preempt war terms warming and the case solves innovation arguments in order to make that like serve its function. I do think that you set yourself up for a really good 2NR and that the speech was mostly really good. This was, for me, my decision was really kind of like a devil's in the details situation. So yeah, that's it for me.
I agree with everything that's been said, and I think that was my fundamental problem as well at the end of the debate was there was just a general lack of like second level responses to AF arguments on the DA that mitigated the risk of the dissad sufficiently for me. So I'll just go through the pieces of the DA and similarly end with the impact scenario. I thought that the neg is right about gun control, that there's nothing formal on the agenda right now, but I don't think that's the central question of either of the thumpers. I thought the AF's evidence in the 1AR extrapolation is that Biden is pushing this action and is even, I think one of their cards says that Biden is contemplating executive action on the matter and that will cause, you know, some congressional backlash. So I think even though it might not be a high risk of like formal derailment of a bill that's on the agenda, more time spent explaining how the fact that this is priced into Biden's political calculation means that he'll still have enough PC left over despite this gun control issue to deal with the plan and infrastructure, or rather deal with infrastructure at the same time, would be helpful. But in my opinion, it was just a lot of back and forth about whether it's truly at the top of the docket, and not a lot of time spent addressing the AF's explanation of the implication for that argument. And I thought the same is true for the immigration thumper. I don't think either side is doing a great job of evidence comparison on the immigration question, so I didn't spend like a ton of time investigating the truth value of the cards on either side. But I think that the AF's evidence and argument is a little bit stronger than you give it credit for in the 2NR, especially the evidence, their Bush evidence that says that there might even be an immigration provision added to the infrastructure bill. So I think all of these things complicate the likelihood that the plan is the only thing that's going to derail the infrastructure bill in the status quo, and more time addressing those distinctions by the AF, aside from just fronting that, you know, infrastructure is the top of the docket and all of this is already priced in, would be helpful for me in terms of distinguishing the DA from what seems to be coming down the line from the AF's perspective. There was one additional AF argument that I thought was clear throughout the 2AC, 1AR, and 2AR, which is that the plan is just executive action and doesn't necessarily require congressional involvement. So I think when you're explaining the link argument, the best explanation I had in the 2NR was that the plan costs Biden PC because he has to get conservative hawks on board and also get liberal institutionalist Democrats on board with reducing our alliance commitment in this way, and that derails infrastructure. So I was just a bit perplexed in terms of how that interacted with how the AF to me had been consistently explaining what the AF process is in response to that link argument. I will say I spent a lot of time thinking about whether, even if I thought there was a totally minimal risk of the DA, if like the small chance that there was one outweighed the AF's impact, because I was just like, I was just perplexed about the AF's impact in general. But after going back through my flow, I think that that was more a consequence of the fact that there wasn't specific defense to this AI norms extinction scenario earlier on in the debate. So there just wasn't a lot of development about that specific scenario. And so I think that the AF, I think that you should spend more time earlier on in the debate explaining this scenario, because I definitely have the 1AR extending that private cooperation with NATO is key to AI norms. But I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I think it's clear that this is a bit confusing of a scenario. And so more explanation of the terminal impact would be helpful, so that you don't have to spend so much time in the 2AR explaining why the case turns the DA and not the other way around. I think fronting that earlier on in the debate will allow you to make more distinctions and extrapolations about the smaller pieces of the disad in the 2AR.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add, you know, other than my thoughts. But I think Northwestern's running like a lot higher risk of disadvantage in this terminal impact than I think that you'd like them to be. I think that they're probably just like capital T truth correct on the 10 votes for the warming thing. I don't think that the negatives evidence is all that descriptive or predictive about Republicans ever signing on to a Green New Deal. I think their evidence goes so far as to say like Manchin and Sinema voted against a Green New Deal, like, which I thought was like a pretty aggressive line. I think that just strategically, I think you're narrowing the scope of this disad a little too dangerously. Like I understand like maybe like a reconciliation at warming, or just like, but like kicking out of the economy, just going for warming, normal 10 votes. I just don't. And I think Northwestern's probably just like right on the uniqueness debate. Stuff like that. I thought the Thumpers debate and the link about the plans and executive order is just like death by 1,000 cuts of what's probably not the best disad ever. And by what's not the best disad ever, I mean like what's not the best, you know, it's like, you know, but I mean, yeah, look at Arvin. I mean, come on. Yeah, it's like a 60 vote warming disad. I mean, yeah. Yeah, versus like almost like a dropped advantage. Like you're only going for terminal impact defense, no solvency presses, and none of your arguments really, I think, address their AI stuff. Thoughts, ways people could do better. Nina, I think you could be doing the double bind on the thumper debate a little bit more, impacting out what the thumpers mean. You know, the double bind, either this means that it has non-unique or it disproves the link, right? I think you're just saying it, but there's like args to be made. I think you should be re-highlighting some of their cards, like you know, their thumper answer to gun control. The last unhighlighted part is like literally like, we have a lot of bipartisan legislation that's being talked about, ununderlined, unhighlighted, small, and we have a lot of bills that come from the House that we want to put on the floor and get votes on and hopefully pass them. I mean, like, you re-highlight that, that's their gun control. That's just like, yeah, you know, I do think like the fact that there's no infrastructure bill, and you're like, there's no bill. And they're like, well, there's no bill. You know, it's like, come on. Sneaky with the warming and stuff. I don't think you need to spend near that much time in the 2AR on it, Nina. Like, you don't have impact defense. Like, you know, I don't know. I just didn't think that like extinction only. I just thought that you spent like 30 seconds there, 45 seconds there in the 2AR. And I just didn't think it was that big of a deal and stuff. So impacting out the double binds and stuff. For the 2NR, I might have just voted neg if you had extended link determined direction uniqueness. I was waiting for you to say that because I don't think the 1AR answered that. And that's one of those ticky-tacky ways that you got to lie, cheat, and steal to win on lies. And I think that if you had maybe extended link determines the direction of unique debate, conceded 1AR framing argument, conceded link debate. I could have looked at Northwestern and been like, you know, link determines direction uniqueness. I don't have you conceding the link debate stuff. It at least helps. I also think that you could have potentially kicked planks of your counter plan to solve for their first advantage that you didn't have terminal impact defense to. No one asked if the planks were conditional. I think that there's some planks that you could have kicked out of to maybe at least do some game against this norm setting terminal impact that they end up going for. I think, that could have helped nullify, I think, what ultimately came out. So like maybe those two things and stuff like that. I think you're just spending a little bit too much time on the disad. I think you get a little repetitive. I think you could group arguments, be a little bit more efficient in the 2NR, maybe get to case. I know you don't have a lot of case arguments and stuff like that, but at least just analytically dissecting stuff. I think a flaw of a lot of modern debaters is like, y'all aren't comfortable like really screwing stuff up with analytics, like re-highlighting terminal impacts, be like, yeah, this card lists 1,000 different alt causes. Even if you don't have a card to make an arg, I think you could have done a little bit more game against that stuff. Like, I think you're just letting them get away with a little nebulous of impacts. I thought the block was great. I mean, it was overall a really impressive debate. I mean, I had to think. I don't like thinking, so kudos and stuff. But like ultimately, really high risk of an AF, really, really, really low risk of what's probably a lie of a disad. Great debate. Yeah, I don't really have. I have to answer questions, but I don't have anything else to add. I thought the other two judges gave great RFDs.
We don't have any questions. Thank you all.
Yeah, that all made sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and good luck, Dartmouth.
Good luck.
Good luck.
You know, the only thing I would have recommended too, y'all probably may never read this app again, but I think you could have been a little bit more litigious or legal eagle about the exact wording of the counter plan text, because they're like, we define cyber attacks, and then they're like cyber war, and then they're like cyber espionage. And those are like all three different things. And their counter plan text is sort of like conflating those terminologies and stuff. I think you should have maybe set up, I think, the like perm to the counterplan debate a little bit more with the counterplan text, a little bit more clearly in the cross. I knew where you were at, but I think that they used some terms that I think could have come back and bit them more in the butt later and stuff.
Was
like
that like 2NC cross-ex going
That was
anywhere
like
for you? That like same page or no?
So I loved what you were doing on that cross-ex and stuff, but like I really liked your cross-ex of the counter plan, trying to prove perm to the counter plan because it includes the scope or it links to the net benefit and stuff. My specific thing was just, if I can find the exact, it's like declare that there's a distinction between cyber war and cyber espionage, but the first plank is broaden the conditions to activate it to include cyber and hybrid attacks. So they like broaden to include cyber attacks, but then they distinguish between cyber war and cyber espionage. But if you win that cyber war and cyber espionage are under the umbrella term of cyber attacks, that counterplan text is like impossible.
Yeah. Then it can't solve advantage two because they're distinguished, but within the same category of a war.
Exactly. And so and like they're good at debate. This was really good, well-written counterplan and stuff like that. But I think it's just narrow thing. And maybe everybody could have spoken a little more stupid. Just like y'all assume that we understand a lot of stuff, especially I think like in cross-ex 2NC. I think, Nina, instead of being like your counterplan test says XYZ, I would take a minute to sort of explain your arg. I'd be like, so look, here's our argument. You need to do blah, 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 blah. The counterplan text says blah, 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 right? I think sort of set up the argument and then ask your question a little bit more, because I think that would help me follow the trace. And then I think Arvin was just like, well, the app doesn't do that either. Like you should just nip that in the bud by making your argument and then asking him the question and be like, look, stop talking about evidence. Like, stop it. Instead of just being like this, and they're like, evidence. But because you want to be a little bit more, I think, nitpicky about like cyber attacks, cyber war, cyber espionage, right? Like, and this is like maybe the attorney in me, but like those are very distinct things. And so like maybe being like, that's the umbrella category. How is this even theoretically possible? I would have been like, yeah, I could see that the counterplain text theoretically contradicts itself with its separate planks and stuff. And I think you were trying to get there, but I liked it and stuff. But I mean, excellent debate by everybody. Arvind, you just like are so unclear on cards, like pretty bad, like you're like kind of unpleasant and stuff. I was like clear, and then I was like clear, and so I think you could really improve your clarity and stuff. And it's not a speed thing. Like you can be fast and clear. I just think you kind of like, I think what you should do is you try to get quieter when you spread on cards. I think you should try and speak a little softer on cards. And I think that that would prevent you from being so unclear on cards.
Okay, thanks everybody. Good debate.
Thank y'all.